Yeah, so not my usual spot. I've just decided that for this video I'm gonna make talking about the Odyssey, the only way I can do it is kind of in parts. I'm currently dog sitting, so there are dogs all around me. I just decided the only way I was gonna do a video about the Odyssey is probably in parts, because I have tried to think of how to sit down and do it just like all in one go. It's near impossible for me. It's literally been almost a week since I saw it, and I'm still trying to get all my thoughts together on it, because there is so much to talk about in terms of, I mean, you could go on and on about the filmmaking, you can talk about the adaptation, but the acting, and, you know, I'm sure people have lots of thoughts on the production and the costume design and everything else. Like, there's so much to talk about. So I don't really know how this is gonna go. We're gonna see how I can somehow ramble on. So to set the stage, obviously, you know, if you've been on this channel before, you know I did reactions to kind of the two primary trailers that came out, mostly looking at it. I always said the big thing for me was the script. As much as for a lot of people, like, the visuals are the most important thing, like the costuming and everything else is the most important thing. To me, and like, while that is a part of the film, a film is a story. So your story needs to be solid, right? So for me, the script is gonna be one of the most important things. And because, again, looking at the Odyssey, this epic poem that in Greek is over 12,000 lines, that has so many, you know, various little subplots and everything else as a part of it, like where you turn your focus is often going to determine how the script goes. And I was just curious to be like, what did Nolan latch onto with the Odyssey? Like, what part of the overall story did he, and the plot, did he, like, what was the thing that like he latched onto and decided to build his film script around? So I went to see it. I saw it in IMAX, not IMAX 70 mil. I think the closest one is a couple 100 miles away from me. So no, just regular IMAX. I went on Friday, so what would that be, the 17th? At like 11:05 in the morning, early afternoon. I think there were maybe 10 free seats in my theater. Everything else was packed. I just want to say I had a great audience. I'm so grateful I had a good audience. Like, nobody's phone went off. Nobody went on their phone the whole time. Everybody, it was quiet. Like, there was no excessive talking or anything else. I mean, my audience was locked in. And for a film that has a 2-hour and 52-minute runtime, that audience was locked in for 3 hours. It was really impressive. And I think that's a testament to how the film caught them. I can say that were I not looking at my watch periodically, very specifically, because if I'm going to be analyzing a film and I think I'm gonna make a video, the big thing is I look at my watch to figure out the exact start time of the film. So not when it's officially said it's gonna start, it's, okay, previews are done and everything else, what time does this movie start? And then because Nolan tends to follow a fairly strict 3-act structure, I would look at my watch periodically for when I was pretty sure each act was like ending and we were shifting into the next act. So, I mean, give or take a couple minutes around there, but that's sort of when I was looking. Beyond that, I would not have looked at my watch and I would have been locked in. I absolutely took like blind notes in the theater, and I mean blind because it's dark. I'm not turning on any light to be able to look at what I'm writing, so I'm kind of flipping pages, probably unnecessarily, because I can't tell where I am on the page, and I'm not even looking at the page while I'm writing. My various notes and quips were very hysterical to look at. Of course, the thing is you try to only write like one word per act. Like, don't be sitting there taking tons and tons and tons of notes, you might miss stuff. And most of my stuff is like random quips or stuff that I'm noticing. But when I finished the film, when the film's finished and the credits are rolling, the lights kind of came more up, I took out my phone and I started writing in my notes app. And my initial notes that I took in my notes app is sort of like gut reaction, like, what am I seeing? Which was, number one, I said the Odyssey structured through the stages of grief. I said Act 1, denial, Act 2, kind of anger/defiance, and Act 3 is acceptance. And I said, you know, Troy is the apocalypse, with the sea people seen as the ultimate repercussions for the locos/solos of the horse, and the idea of the war to end all wars and the end of the heroic/Bronze Age. A lot of that is stuff I would have written about just the Odyssey in general. And then a couple other things where I said things I'm, as I said, not sure how I feel about. Like stuff that was just sort of sitting, like, just sort of undecided in my gut. And those were some of the things I really wanted to think on, because it's going, is there an objective issue with what I'm looking at? Or is it the, you can interpret this many ways, depends on how you're writing the script, etc. So a lot of that. I suppose, like, it's important to talk about the Odyssey itself to a degree. with regards then to the adaptation. One, and this sort of comes down to costuming. I know a lot of people have had so much to say about the costuming. It's like, why is it not the Bronze Age? And I've said previously in my reactions to trailers that, look, I've kind of given up on seeing like accurate Bronze Age costuming put on the screen. We've never gotten it before. And anybody who says, well, the Troy movie was better, no, none of the women's costumes look accurate at all. The men's armor is not like totally correct. Like, no, they didn't do any better. Like, let's be real, they didn't do any better. I've just sort of given up, it's not gonna happen. One is oftentimes with how you wanna do these battle scenes, the Bronze Age armor that we know of, and especially we're looking very specifically at late Bronze Age, it's kind of cumbersome. It doesn't allow for some of the stuff that you want to do on screen, and there's plenty of other reasons. I don't know all the reasons for why Nolan went the direction he did. Like, personally, I want a multi-hour documentary showing me every single aspect of pre-production and production, how and why choices were made. Because that, to me, helps me make sense, even more so of what I'm seeing visually. But I think it's important to mention that while the Odyssey is technically taking place in the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age. The date that's usually thrown around for the idea of if you're trying to put a historical date on these events, like roughly people say around 1250 BCE. And so that's the late Bronze Age. You're getting close to when it ends. When is the collapse? Except, and this is really important, the culture, the structures, the bureaucracies, like everything else that is reflected in the Odyssey is not strictly the Bronze Age. Because remember, the Odyssey is being passed down orally because the Bronze Age collapses. The date I like to go with, and I think it fits because I happen to have the book with me. This is by Eric H. Klein. I recommend this book to everybody. If you want to know a little bit about the historical period there of the Mediterranean in general, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. It's kind of like the beginning of what will be the collapse of the Bronze Age, especially in, Mycenaean Greece, various islands, other big kind of empires that are, or civilizations we'll say, that are there around the same time. I mean, Hittites, Hyksos, Egypt, Middle East, like all of that. There's a lot going on there, and they're reasonably interconnected. And so then you hit the Dark Ages, these centuries in Greece that were marked, I call it like a black hole, in that you have total illiteracy. I mean, absolute illiteracy. They're writing in Linear A and Linear B. Then the Dark Ages hit, and then they have to borrow a whole new alphabet from the Phoenician culture and slightly adjust it to fit their language, and they never go back to Linear A and B. It's just gone. Literacy just seems to utterly disappear. And all of the culture that we understand now of Mycenaean Greece, of Bronze Age Greece, is gone. It vanishes. It never comes back. Again, we know more about Bronze Age Greece than we'll say, if you believe in the idea of somebody named Homer writing this down, we know more than Homer did. Even in this book, Klein notes that there's a whole bunch of anachronisms across Homer, where some of the stuff, like especially if you look at the Iliad, like some of the arms and armaments and of the armor and stuff that's being talked about, it have actually been out of date by 1250 BCE. Like, no, they weren't using that anymore. And that's because what you're looking at in the form of the, we'll say almost historicity or historical value of something like the Odyssey and the Iliad is what's called folk memory. So this is clearly a memory of something happening, and it just gets orally passed down. And so things adjust and change. And there is an element in the Odyssey of kind of like almost postmodernism metafiction, because what you end up with in terms of trying to look at like what historical period is the Odyssey. Yes, technically we're in the Bronze Age, but it does seem to be a combination of Bronze Age with a bit of Dark Age, with a little bit of that transitional into the Archaic Age. So it's like three different historical periods in a trench coat. And that's why often we talk about Homeric Greece, because it sort of exists as its own thing. It's presenting a culture that did and didn't exist at the same time. In that way, it is Schrodinger's history. Like, what is it exactly? It does give you wiggle room to play, but if you want to sit there and be like, well, technically, yes, it is taking place in the late Bronze Age. Therefore, what you're seeing on screen from Nolan, none of it is reflective costume-wise of the Bronze Age. I will say the addition of pants did kind of make me laugh, because there's a whole thing when you read Herodotus, who is then writing about, say, the Greco-Persian wars, as they get called. One thing the Greeks talk about is that, oh my God, these Persians, what are they doing? They're so weird. They wear trousers. What are these things they're wearing? Because the Greeks, I guess, famously didn't. So admittedly, seeing the pants did make me laugh. But we are looking at the late Bronze Age, which means Nolan was a little clever in bringing in some things. One notable historical element that he brings in that's present nowhere in the Odyssey or the Iliad is this idea of the sea peoples. Now, part of the reason I have this book with me is I did want to refer to it because we can talk about the sea peoples. And I want to read a bit here from this book. This is the prologue where we talk about the sea people. It says, the warriors entered the world scene and moved rapidly, leaving death and destruction in their wake. Modern scholars refer to them collectively as the sea peoples, but the Egyptians who recorded their attack on Egypt never used that term, instead identifying them as separate groups working together. The Peliset, the Chekar, the Shekelesh, the Shardana, Danuna, and Weshesh. Foreign-sounding names for foreign-looking people. We know little about them, beyond what the Egyptian records tell us. We are not certain where the sea peoples originated. Perhaps in Sicily, Sardinia, and Italy, according to one scenario. Perhaps in the Aegean or Western Anatolia, or possibly even Cyprus or the Eastern Mediterranean. No ancient site has ever been identified as their origin or departure point. And that's part of the thing, is these sea peoples, they get collectively meshed together, mostly because I believe it was a French historian or archaeologist who first gave them that name of the sea peoples. Again, the ancient writings never refer to them collectively as that. They refer to these disparate and different groups. For example, and you talk about like where's their origin, like Shekelesh, they wonder if that is Sicily. Shardana, is that Sardinia? Danuna, is that the Danaans? There's one where the combination of, is that the Achaeans? Because it ends up breaking down to the exact same word that Homer uses to describe the Greeks. He very specifically refers to them as the Achaeans. And it does seem that some of these groups came from like the Aegean and Anatolia. They kind of came from all over. And so I personally love that when we have the mentions of the sea peoples in Christopher Nolan's Odyssey and they feel like this kind of looming threat, but there is a moment in the film which seems to be a nod to Odysseus and his men's sacking of the island of Ismaros. Ismaros being the home of these groups of peoples called the Kikones. And while they're talking to one of the islanders, he asks if they are these people, we've heard of these roaming, so almost like pirates from the sea, are you the sea peoples? And they say essentially, yes, we are. That's not entirely wrong. Would they have been all of the sea peoples? No. But yes, some of the sea peoples, it does seem, came from the Aegean and might have been the Achaeans, whom Homer speaks of. I thought that was a neat touch. Another addition is we see in this flashback between Penelope and Odysseus, they're discussing how the war is really just Agamemnon's excuse to capture the trade routes. Absolutely, there were likely scuffles over trade routes. We know in the late Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was quite interconnected. These various cultures of the Mediterranean were in contact with each other. I mean, we have evidence that of tablets, but also we've found various is that like Mycenaean and Cretan pottery that's in the Middle East? And we see this transfer of goods and maybe services and everything else. It's why often the Mediterranean gets called kind of like a nursery, the Bronze Age Mediterranean, because that also then leads to the development of naval technology. So yeah, they're all in contact. Again, it all kind of falls apart in the Dark Age, and some cultures do better than others in terms of, we'll say, surviving and recovering in the Bronze Age. I'd say probably the culture that does the best is the culture that we call the Phoenicians. They seem to do the best. Egypt is sort of up there, but a lot of these cultures kind of fall apart. And again, what leads to the Bronze Age collapse is still kind of a big question mark. Was it one sort of singular event, or is it a series of things that just build atop each other? And that leads us to what is the Iliad and the Odyssey a memory of? And I'm going to lump the Iliad in here together with the Odyssey because, one, they are kind of siblings, they go together, but also because Nolan's Odyssey does look outside of the Odyssey itself. We see that in a lot of the flashback that we get of the war at Troy. While there are certainly a couple flashbacks and stories to it in the Odyssey, you obviously get a lot more of it in the Iliad, but even the Iliad doesn't show you the sacking of Troy. By this point, we would say the most famous, probably long-form representation of what happens during the sack at Troy comes to us from Virgil's Aeneid. Now, Virgil is a Roman writer coming to us in the 1st century CE during the reign of Augustus. It's why I like to make a joke of Roman propaganda, that he presents the destruction of Troy and the Greeks in particular. I mean, he lays into the Greeks. He is staunchly anti-Greek, and that's because it's the Aeneid. The protagonist is Aeneas. He is a man of Troy. He's said to be eventually the mythological founder of Rome. It's taking a very specific slant, and because if you look at the reign of Augustus, Augustus was instituting these kind of morality laws, and the Romans had a very different view of morality and conduct and all of that than, say, the ancient Greeks of, Homer's time. And even then, they're talking about a folk memory of a culture that's even before that. Rome had a very different view. So the behavior of the Greeks in the sacking of Troy is presented quite differently in that it is absolutely like he lays into them and calls them barbaric. Now, it is important to note that when the Iliad and Odyssey are getting written down, the story of the sacking of Troy was known. The story was already well known. Again, it's a folk memory. It's being passed down. And the destruction of Troy is meant to be quite a near cataclysmic event. It is something that is completely shocking in that it is incredibly violent. I always want to make a point of saying, look, the sacking of Troy was an immensely violent event. It is understood that Troy is razed to the ground, like nothing is left. All of the people are either killed or enslaved, with the exception of the, gaggle who managed to escape with Aeneas. Everybody else, you're enslaved or you're killed. Look, that's just an understanding. And the Iliad especially foreshadows and is sort of obsessed with that looming event, because obviously the Iliad is being written down with the understanding of, we know how the story ends already, but we're looking at a small little pocket of time in the 9th year of the war. So again, you don't see the sacking of Troy there, but it's understood what that would be. And Troy in the Iliad is presented, for all intents and purposes, as a Greek polis, a Greek city-state. Yes, there are some things that are made to show it's foreign. Oh my God, Priam has 50 sons or 50 children. That's so wild. There's small little things to be it's foreign, it's Eastern, we'll say, but basically it's non-Greek. But it is, for all intents and purposes, a Greek polis. Somebody listening in the Archaic Age would have been that sounds familiar. And mind you, the idea of the Greek of the polis did not really start until the Archaic Age. And while there's the element of these small little city-states, we'll say, are kind of kingdoms unto themselves, we think, in the Bronze Age, there is sort of the center of Mycenae. There does seem to be a sort of more central sort of power. So again, Odyssey and Iliad are 3 different historical ages in a trench coat while taking place in the Bronze Age, technically.
We love it.
So, the destruction of Troy is a massive sort of world-changing event. And this is where I always say, think of the Trojan War. If you were to lay out the Greek mythology as especially this sort of era of heroes as a kind of very wibbly-wobbly, makes no sense timeline, again, it will make no sense. Don't try to make it make sense. But Troy is pretty easy because it's at the end. Not much happens after that. Maybe some of the heroes of the Trojan War, their children maybe have an adventure or two, but that's kind of it. It ends. Why? We're coming to terms with the ending of the Bronze Age. But I always say, if you look at then military conflicts in the historiography of the Greek mythology, Troy is like World War I, in that it is the war to end all wars. They don't have a World War II, they just have sort of a World War I. And that is because you think of World War I. World War I was this long, attritional war. And it was also important in how it was a paradigm shift. War kind of changed after World War I because it also became a technology war, in that it was everybody trying to find new ways to kill each other en masse. And if you look at Troy, it's similar. And even more so, the war that was most similar to World War I before then, in terms of it being an attritional war, you would look at something like the American Civil War. And in the history of myth, the most important kind of military exercise or conflict that happens prior to the war at Troy is that of the 7 against Thebes and the Epigonoi. Now, the 7 against Thebes, it's the fallout of, if anybody's familiar with the story of Oedipus or Oedipus, he had 2 sons who he left to basically trade off rulership. Of course, that's never going to work. One brother banishes the other. The banished brother comes back with 6 allies. The 7 against Thebes. They have this massive siege war because obviously Thebes has walls. It ends with all of the 7 being killed. Both of the sons of Oedipus are killed. I believe he also is said to have 7 allies, and I think or 6 allies, so they are also the 7 defenders. I think they are all killed as well. The uncle Creon takes over, and then there is a whole period where Thebes is like, shit, those 7 attackers all had sons. before they left to fight this campaign. How much do you want to bet those sons are going to come back and try and do what their fathers couldn't? Thebes reinforces their walls. So all of a sudden you get the epigonoi. These are the sons of the 7 attackers who show up, and they're fighting against an even stronger Theban wall. Crazy enough, they pull through. They win. And put the banished son, Polynices, they put his son on the throne of Thebes. So you have that. It is a long siege, kind of attritional war. I mean, in that case, ended with basically everybody dead, and the status quo didn't change, and then you get the epigonoi who come through, but that's also an attritional war and a siege against a walled city. Similarly, you have the American Civil War, which was highly attritional. Then you get World War I, which is just changing. I mean, essentially a generation, almost and a half, is completely wiped out. Nothing is ever really the same. You have to change the way you fight by creating new different ways to kill each other. Then you look at the war at Troy, this long attritional siege war that's happening there. I mean, it takes a decade. It essentially wipes out like a generation and a half for a lot of both sides. I mean, in the case of Troy, it just wipes out Troy. And then you look at the Trojan horse, a new and different way to kill each other. And here's the thing about the horse. I mentioned 2 words earlier where I was writing like, oh, it's, because of the lokos and the dolos of the Trojan horse. These are 2 Greek words. Dolos, D-O-L-O-S, essentially means trick. A lokos, L-O-K-H-O-S, means an ambush. And it's not just an ambush, it's a night ambush. And this is important because in the Iliad, there are several moments where Agamemnon seems to have this seemingly inexplicable anxiety that Hector, who is, the greatest warrior on the side of the Trojans, is going to basically lead a night attack against the Greeks. Now, we might think in the modern day, well, yeah, no, lead a night attack, totally makes sense, all this. But then you don't even have to think too hard about why this would seem almost improbable because Chris Nolan showed it to us. I think of the scene where after they come out of the horse and it's night and they're slaying guards, somebody runs up to the top of the walls of Troy and drops a torch on the other side. When the torch hits the ground, it's all of a sudden, holy shit, there are people there. Basics, vision. Nobody ever attacks at night in the Iliad, and we're given no indication that a night attack or a night battle ever really happens in the Trojan War until you get to the sacking. For basics reasons of how the fuck are you gonna see? The whole point of fighting at night is you want to surprise your enemy, right? But if you can't fucking see, you have a big problem of people could accidentally engage in what we could call essentially a version of friendly fire. You can't see what's going on. You can't have any sort of organization of what you're doing. Not that anybody seems to have been at least in the Iliad and the Odyssey, have been doing any sort of organized battle tactics here because everybody's a citizen soldier. There's no standard army. The only culture at this time that seems to be almost at the idea of a standing army is Egypt, and that's because it's Ramesses II who's on the throne, but even that is still really early in its genesis. You can't see. So what are you going to do? Bring torches? Well, that takes away the element of surprise. So then what's the point of doing it at night? It's like, well, you could wait for maybe a night with a full moon where you've got moonlight. Again, it kind of takes away the element of surprise because then your enemy's going to see you. It's not like people didn't have guards standing around. Even Troy, we see, has guards around all of that, just in case. On the off chance somebody attacks at night. That's something the Greeks do. They launch a night ambush, something that had not happened before. In addition, you have the whole dolos, the trick of the horse. New ways to kill each other. And something that then leaves you feeling perhaps a bit disillusioned with everything that happened. I mean, there's so much you can hear from either like Imperial War archives, like veterans of World War I, or really good, narrative, sort of autobiographical accounts of just sort of the disillusionment that comes from being in a war like that. And obviously, in World War I, you can look at stuff like shell shock, try and find a sort of psychological equivalent. Absolutely, all of the major players in the Odyssey are suffering from PTSD. Everybody is traumatized. I usually say, you can talk about the plot of the Odyssey, which is what happens in the narrative. Okay, yeah, this guy goes home and all this stuff. That's the plot, the story. What are we really talking about? One element that the Odyssey is absolutely exploring in a very early way without any sort of language to properly kind of try to describe it is the effect of trauma.
Everybody in that story is traumatized. You are looking at a whole lot of very traumatized people, from the veterans coming back from the war to the families that were left behind, also then to someone like Helen, who was basically a POW behind enemy lines for 10 years of that war, and how these highly traumatized people try to bring a sense of making sense or order to this already very unstable and fairly violent world, when for the past at least 10 years of war, and then in the case of Ithaca, another 10 years of Where's Our King, these decades of the world feeling like it got flipped upside down, where nothing made sense anymore. You're trying to make sense of it again. How do you do that when you're also coping with the trauma of a highly attritional war that took 10 years and a whole lot of people didn't come back? Or if they came back with a fuck ton of trauma. It's really part of what makes the Odyssey and its companion, the Iliad, still resonate on a very human level is how human these characters feel. How there was a real understanding that while war for this world was a kind of brutal necessity, it left you changed. It had an effect on the people who fought in it. The Iliad obviously can explore the effect of it on combatants much more, because it is a sort of, we'll call it a martial epic. We are dealing with the fighters at Troy. But Odyssey says, what happens when the war is over and everybody comes home? Like, you did things. You have to cope with that. Additionally, what about the people who were left behind? They have to cope with things. There's a lot of emotion that goes on there in a world where communication does not seem to have been going on a lot between like those fighting at Troy and those at home. And again, what's interesting is the characters of the Iliad and the Odyssey seem to be effectually, functionally illiterate. They're not sending letters and messages and notes to each other, which again, we know people could read and write in the Bronze Age, linear A and B. We've got the evidence of it, but the Dark Age is total illiteracy. Something the Odyssey by Nolan brings up is the idea that people are going to forget how to write. Yeah, they did. They literally did. Forgot how to read and write. And then they had to pick a whole new alphabet because linear A and B never come back. So Troy is this seemingly almost apocalyptic, cataclysmic event. And again, when we're looking at these stories as, was there an actual Trojan War the way it is presented in the Iliad and the Odyssey and all the mythology? No, of course not. But could it be a folk memory of, sure, excursions into, Asia Minor and Anatolia and all that? Yeah, we have evidence of Greeks having gone over there for various little excursions. I mean, we don't know about one big, massive war that sent, 1,000+ ships over there. But we know they were over there. And in terms of the memory of, again, if Troy is functioning as essentially a Greek polis and it's setting the literary precedent for the ancient Greek society of what did it mean for a city to fall and be sacked, I think it's fair to wonder if maybe this is some sort of folk memory of what happened when these palaces at Mycenae and Pylos were burned to the ground. And that's part of the collapse of the Bronze Age. Was that by the Sea Peoples or by others? Well, I don't think we're entirely sure. I think most people argue it is one of the various tribes of the Sea Peoples. But those palaces are burned to the ground. Those cities are sacked. So Troy burning to the ground may come from folk memories of Mycenae and Pylos being burned. And so Christopher Nolan very obviously read the Odyssey and saw, I've got a whole lot of traumatized people. This is all about trauma. And it all really does stem from the conflict at Troy. So you have to deal with that. And this is where I want to kind of move into one element of the film that I liked, but also still kind of slightly cock my head at, which is this idea of what gets called in the film Zeus's Law. Now, Zeus's Law, I think, is very obviously referring to Xenia. Xenia in ancient Greek culture is this idea of guest-host rights and relations. It's very specific. Now, it was pretty highly ritualized. There was sort of a steps you had to go through. And a lot of it comes from this idea of what's called theoxenia. Theoxenia is guest-host rights when it comes to theoi, the gods. You never knew if you were meeting a god in disguise. So it was essentially, how did you treat wayfarers and strangers and travelers if they came to your home? And if you were a wayfarer, stranger, or traveler, somebody, and you went to somebody else's home, how did you behave? Again, Xenia was a two-way relationship. Hosts to guests and guests to hosts. Now, the film seems to both simplify and expand this idea. They break it down to the idea of do unto others as you would have done unto you. While yes, that is sort of at the core of Xenia, it is, again, very specific in terms of being about guests and hosts, about being in somebody else's home. Now, the film seems to take the idea of Zeus's Law and potentially move outside of the home. But even in the context of the Odyssey, it never does. Every every single encounter in the Odyssey is ultimately hinging around this idea of Xenia, because it is the one moral constant in the world of the Odyssey. And think about it. A whole lot of traumatized people who feel like the world kind of doesn't make this, again, who are living in an already unstable world, and we're dealing with, say, the 10 years of Troy, feel like it kind of got flipped on its head and was sort of in flux and chaos. What do you hold on to? Okay, well, we can all agree on this one thing: how you treat people in your home and how you behave in somebody else's home. Okay, cool. We got, like, that's our one thing we cling to. We cling to that to make sense of this world and identify the civilized and the uncivilized. In the Odyssey, again, that's why part of why Odysseus is constantly traveling to other places, but he always is entering somebody else's home. Even starting with, you go to Ismaros and we raid. We raid. It does seem to be kind of a thing that the Greek heroes did. There's an epithet known as Toliportos, which means like sacker of cities, raider of cities. And Odysseus isn't just a Toliportos. He gets known as O Toliportos. And that article really denotes Odysseus as something special, because he's the only one of the heroes who gets that. Even though several get called Toliportos, he's the only one who's called O Toliportos. And that O is like, you are the sacker of cities, and you are the sacker of the city. This is the guy who was the sacker of Troy, the guy who engineered the Trojan horse gambit, right? But that seems pretty normal, but even then, he behaves well in the case of a priest of Apollo, and that's where he gets why inextricably found, which plays a role in the Polyphemus incident. And then next you move into stuff like the Lotus Eater stuff, and it's all, how are you behaving in these other people's homes when you are trying to function as a guest? And also, how were they behaving to you? Again, Xenia permeates the Odyssey. And I do appreciate that the film is constantly mentioning this idea of what they call Zeus's law. It's being brought up all the time. It is also part of why the situation on Ithaca is kind of the way that it is. Some of the issues that I have with how the film treated it, and while it does kind of make sense in the context of the film and what Nolan is trying to explore, especially in the terms of Odysseus' psyche, is that Xenia does not play a role with the Trojan horse. These are combatants in a war. Xenia doesn't apply with what was done there. Last I checked, the Trojans were not inviting the Greeks in for dinner. They were not hosting them, and the Greeks were not guests. These are combatants in a war. Xenia does not apply. It's not a violation of Xenia. Now, given how Zeus's law, that idea is expanded in the film to seemingly take place as a general rule all over the place, then I guess maybe. But again, I would also say you're in war. The rules are in a way sort of different regardless, but we are also exploring Odysseus' psyche in the mind of somebody who even gets called out by Athena to be like your level of hubris, thinking this is all you and all about you, like thinking that means he violated Zeus's law. Yeah, that is kind of hubristic. And the film is very layered in how it plays with that, which is why I say I'm not sure how I feel about it. I go, it does kind of make sense. It's just that Odysseus would never have a reason to think that, because he would know better than anyone. I didn't violate Zeus's law. Like, I didn't violate Xenia. Duh, everybody would know that. And this, in my head, when Odysseus was talking about that, in my head I was sort of jokingly going, what is this Roman propaganda? But if that's just how he feels, and this is a very perspective-driven film, okay, sure. Additionally, we come to the ending of the film, which departs radically from the Odyssey in that it has Odysseus and Penelope going off into exile, because it's claiming that Odysseus has violated Zeus's law by slaughtering the suitors in his house.
No.
Not at all. It's actually not a Xenia violation. We're made very clear that it's not a Xenia violation. Because here's the thing. The god that is most associated with Xenia is Zeus. Zeus Xenios. He is the protector of basically that very, to them, sacred concept. And given, even in the film they do this, he throws down basically drama, lightning, and thunder, and makes it clear that he's very okay that everything is about to happen. Odysseus is in no way violating Xenia, mainly because the suitors violate it first. The idea is that if one person violates Xenia, all bets are basically off. At that point, the other person kind of has the right to do whatever they want. In this case, the suitors have absolutely violated Xenia because they are imposing upon their host. They are eating him out of house and home. They're behaving inappropriately to his wife and to his son. They are not behaving well. And even when Odysseus is there in disguise, they keep this part where Antinous chucks a footstool at Odysseus and whacks him on the back. They are behaving abominably. At that point, all bets are off. Odysseus has the right to do whatever the hell he wants with them in the context of the Odyssey. And so in the context of the film, while they do set up this idea of you can't kill them, you'll be banished, I'm like, one, I don't think anybody is really going to care about what's going on Ithaca. They are a pretty small, not that important island. They are kind of the backwoods. And compared to the other kind of city-states and kingdoms, would have been considered much poorer. Like, I don't think anybody's really going to care. Now, the Odyssey itself does have book 24. The final book of the Odyssey, wherein some of the fathers of the suitors, they all hear what's happened. Now, well, we'll say about over half of them basically say, I'm taking my son's body home and I'm going to give him funerary honors. Like, you know what? Yeah. A whole bunch of them basically gather together in their little council and just say, this is fucked up. Like, I think we basically enact a blood feud and we go after Odysseus. Now, there is a seer on Ithaca who appears throughout the story who basically says,
What are you talking about?
You knew what your sons were doing. You knew their behavior was bad. You did nothing about it. You could have stopped all this for years. You did nothing about it. You have no leg to stand on. You can't just say he violated Xenia because look at everything your sons were doing for years and you didn't even bother to stop them or chastise them for their behavior. Also, I heard a god was there with Odysseus. Now, the whole thing is Athena is way more present and like there, and they all see her or see her in some sort of shape while there, and Odysseus is slaughtering everybody. So, like, again, this has to do kind of with the role of the gods where they're just like, there was totally a god there on Odysseus' side. Like, he's got the backing of Olympus. Like, he's not getting in trouble for this. Now, these fathers basically say, we don't care, we're angry, we're going to go. One of them being Antinous' father. Because, of course, when they roll up, Odysseus is with his father, Laertes, at this point. There's a brief almost scuffle, but it takes Athena coming down with, like, a divine megaphone in one of the earliest versions we have of a true Deus Ex Machina, blaring on her divine megaphone saying, everybody stop, I'm fucking sick of this shit, sign peace treaties and be done. And that's how the Odyssey ends. It can feel a little anticlimactic, because we're driving towards the slaughter of the suitors. This is a very quick tie everything up with a bow denouement. I had a feeling we weren't going to do that because I don't think it suits Nolan. It can feel like kind of that's the end, especially coming off of the catharsis of the slaughter of the suitors and the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. What I did not expect was this idea that they would feel they need to go into exile. And again, I can't say that the script didn't set it up. It did. It's just me looking at it kind of sideways going, but that's not really how Xenia works. Not really what would have happened when you look at the world of the Odyssey. But because they have slightly adjusted how Zeus's law is interpreted in the film, I can't argue that it wasn't set up and that it doesn't flow with what has been established. This comes down to me going, I don't know if I agree with that, right? And I don't know how I feel about this idea that Xenia, which is a very specific relationship, has just become this idea of do unto others as you would have done unto you, in a world that we have proven is quite dangerous and violent. It does seem just a little odd. It's bittersweet. It is beautiful. I think it fits everything that he was setting up, especially with the idea that this is, as I said, the stages of grief, where we're coming to Odysseus eventually having to reach a kind of acceptance that he has done something that has fully shifted the world, in that he invented a new kind of warfare in that way. A true nasty trick and a night ambush. Like, the Trojan War changed things. Things are never going to be the same after the Trojan War. Which, again, if you look at, like, a sort of timeline of the mythology, yeah, it's true. Nothing is the same after that. It's ending. The collapse of the Bronze Age is coming. And again, you can also argue that the Iliad and the Odyssey are this folk memory of trying to come to terms with what led to the collapse of the Bronze Age. Again, all this folk memory, trying to understand what's happening. And again, in the case of the Odyssey, you can go into, and even the Iliad, you can go into deep analysis of like, the kind of almost early versions of postmodern and like metafiction related to it. Again, these are part of the reason also these poems have stood the test of time, is they're so fucking clever and they're so impressive.
In thinking and talking about the fall of Troy and all of that, I also really want to talk about Agamemnon, because look, when I saw Agamemnon had been cast, I was so excited because I went, oh my God, we're keeping the Agamemnon storyline. Because Agamemnon's storyline is so important to the Odyssey and the character of Odysseus. And even more so if you're exploring the effect of trauma and war upon those who are a part of it, as well as those left behind at home, in terms of the things it makes people do. And here's the thing. People say, like, what is the big deal about Agamemnon? Like, I remember when I was doing my review of Epic, everybody was like, why do you keep going on about Agamemnon? I'm like, I don't think you understand. The first spoken lines of dialogue in the Odyssey are not about Odysseus. They're not about Ithaca. They're not about Telemachus.
They're about Agamemnon. Sure, the poem opens with its classic invocation of the muses, which tells you what the story is going to be about. It's going to be the story of a guy, because the first word is man. It's going to be about a guy. It's going to be about Odysseus. But the first spoken lines of dialogue are, I believe, by Zeus, who's talking about, look what happened with fucking Agamemnon. Like, we fucking told these guys not to do certain things, they still did them. Humans are hopeless, basically. Agamemnon is a direct contrast to Odysseus in terms of what happens to him when he gets home and some aspects of his behavior. And again, this is where a lot of people argue that obviously Iliad and Odyssey have sort of acknowledgments and knowledge of each other without explicitly stating it. A lot of the stuff in terms of contrasting Agamemnon with Odysseus, a lot of it can be seen in behavior in the Iliad. So, Agamemnon is a very important character. And I know there was a lot of talk about they were calling like his Batman black armor and whatever have you. And I was just like, look, I'm gonna wait until I see how that look functions on screen. And I will also be real, when I saw that Benny Safdie had been cast as Agamemnon, I did kind of cock my head going, not who I might have immediately thought of, but let me see what Nolan does, because Nolan, I think, has very particular visions for who he wants to work with as certain characters. So clearly, he had an idea. He wanted Benny Safdie, and honestly, fantastic choice. Oh my God. Fantastic choice. Agamemnon is one of my favorite parts of the film, and the way that he is presented and treated, and just the way that he exists on the screen is one of my favorite aspects. And here's the thing. Yeah, I saw a lot of people, again, call it his black Batman armor. And yeah, it's not period accurate, but like, let's just accept none of this stuff is period accurate and sort of move on from that conversation. Understandably, if you've studied like film costuming, historical costuming, and all of that, I fully understand the gripes. I'm not trying to dismiss them as unimportant. I just think in terms of a film, costuming can be important, but story is more important. And I'm here to talk visual language of film and say, I actually think the black armor and the way that it like sits on his body and everything and the way that he moves on screen, I actually think it all comes together and works. So hear me out on this one. And part of this also comes through, initially I was going to be describing it and still making the kind of Batman armor jokes, but recently I happened to watch the episode, if anybody's familiar with the YouTube series, Hot Ones, which is great and probably one of the greatest interview shows out there because of the questions that are asked. Recently, they released an episode that had Jon Bernthal and Tom Holland. I think they were there technically promoting Spider-Man Brand New Day, but they were both just in the Odyssey. They're kind of doing promotions back to back. And they were talking about costuming and production, and they happened to mention the Agamemnon armor, and they called it like Darth Vader armor. And I went, that's it. That's actually a better comparison than Batman. Darth Vader, especially as he's presented in the first ever Star Wars film, A New Hope, which is highly inspired by the works of Joseph Campbell, which is looking a lot at the structure of Greek myth and other myths around the world. Ooh, Darth Vader fits, and here's why. First time we really get a look at Agamemnon is when we open those gates of Troy, and all of a sudden, holy shit, there's Agamemnon. But he stands there, perfectly calm, while men start rushing in. And then as he comes in, he doesn't rush, he walks. He is perfectly calm. He enters in like Darth Vader. He is this black, looming specter of death. In fact, his face is very difficult to see in the helmet, and I think this is on purpose. You don't get a look a lot at the man inside the armor. He seems more like an imposing, oppressive force than he does a person. And this makes sense given we are in the memories of other people. That whole flashback to Troy is being told through the memories of Menelaus and Odysseus. They would view Agamemnon that way because he was the leader of the expedition, the most powerful king in mainland Greece, according to the Homeric world. So he comes in like this looming specter of death. And then the only time we get even a glimpse of his face is in the underworld. We get a little look at his face from Odysseus' perspective. You can sort of see more of his face in the armor because this is no longer the oppressive force. This is the realization, oh, Agamemnon is in fact just a mortal man who can in fact be killed. He's not something inhuman. He's a guy who, yes, has done horrible things that come back to bite him. Because the only other look we really get at him is when he comes home and is going to be killed by Clytemnestra, which is we take off all that armor. This almost symbol of him being this overwhelming oppressive figure. He's just a guy who gets killed by his wife. Also, speaking of the black armor with the gold accoutrements, did ya peep the lion on one of those like shoulder pieces? I have to assume, I mean, the Lion of Mycenae, I think this is, I would hope it is, a reference to what is known as the Lion Gate of Mycenae. It's this beautiful archaeological, or this structure that has been sort of uncovered. The lions, I believe, are headless, but it's said to be this beautiful gate that's, I believe, part of the entrance of the palace at Mycenae. So the Lion of Mycenae, I was like, oh, I pop you a little lion detail. I see that. And again, also the gold. The gold is used to show the wealth. It's similarly done with Menelaus, where we see a lot more gold because they're just wealthier. They're so much wealthier than Ithaca. Although Penelope herself does have a beautiful gold necklaces that she wears, but the gold on the armor, I mean, it's such a show-off moment. And we hear descriptions of gold in armor and just gold armor in general in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I think that's such a great look at the Agamemnon character, specifically because I have to go and talk about the Iliad a little bit. We have to get really nerdy. And that is because most of the characters who are like these warriors and warrior kings in the Iliad are called by this term basileus. And Agamemnon is called by this term as well. Now, basileus, the plural being basileis, does seem to roughly translate as king, especially if you go later into the classical age. And in fact, they refer to the king of Persia as a basileus. So we think it means something like king, but it doesn't really seem to make sense totally that way when you look at the Homeric epics, and it definitely doesn't mean king when you go back to the Bronze Age, which again is technically when this story is taking place, the late Bronze Age. Obviously, the two writing scripts, we'll say, of ancient Greece at that time were Linear A and Linear B. Linear A we have not translated. We don't know how to translate it yet. Linear B, we figured it out. And we have found the term basileus, but it doesn't mean a king. It seems to mean something more almost like town official, town leader, sorta. It's definitely under the word that was used for king. And this word is wanax. Now, the letter W does seem to kind of vanish out of the Greek alphabet. So the word that it would then become is anax. And anax is a word that does appear in the Iliad. And that very much, we can tell, in the Bronze Age means king. King. And you are above the basileus. There is one character in the Iliad who is ever referred to as an anax, and that is Agamemnon. I always think of the phrase anax andron, which is a phrase that's used to describe Agamemnon. And it means, we'll say almost like king of men, lord of men. I sometimes go, if you want to push it even further, like king of kings. That's not totally accurate, obviously, because andron does not mean king. But Agamemnon is the only one of these Greek warriors and warrior kings, we'll say, who is referred to as the anax. You could look at that and say, we are signaling that this is the guy who's heading the expedition. And so even though there's a lot of talk, especially with book 1 of the Iliad, where Achilles and Agamemnon have their big falling out, like, what is the social status going on here? A lot of argument is, well, it's a social circle of equals, because they're all basically having a big meeting in the agora, which just means meeting grounds at this time. Don't think like a Roman forum or the later classical agora. It literally, at that point, that word just meant meeting area. So they are meeting in the agora of the Greek camp, and you'd say, oh, well, they're social equals, because these are all warriors, these are all kings and all that. And we're like, yeah, in terms of the Greek hero and the Greek warrior, yeah, you would put them all on equal terms. They all have strengths and everything else. But if we talk social bureaucracy, no. Achilles is actually the least eminent, one of the least eminent of everyone there, because he's not even a king. Which is why you look at that term basileus and go, can we even use it to mean king? I mean, Achilles is not king because back in his home, his ancestral seat, we'll say, of Phthia, his father still rules. He has not abdicated. Achilles is not a king. Yeah, he comes with a force of Myrmidons. He's in charge of the Myrmidons there, but he doesn't get to go back to Phthia and be king. Not if his father's alive. Peleus is still there. All of the rest of these men are rulers of their homes and where their city-states, their little kingdoms, their little pockets of bureaucracy that they own. Like they are in charge of that. But even more so, Agamemnon is in charge of all of them. Yes, he also controls the most powerful city-state in Greece. He's controlling Mycenae. Obviously, we call this era the Mycenaean Bronze Age. That does seem to have been the center and the hub. But he's also in charge of all of these men. He is the anax. He is the one who gets the final say. And therefore, I found it so great that he, in the midst of the destruction of Troy and everything, is calm. He's so calm. He is unruffled. He moves through like an inhuman force, this specter of death. This is what he has fought for 10 years. And he's finally achieving it. And he is so like centered and at peace with that, which I think is also a great contrast to his behavior in the Iliad. Because in the Iliad, I'm dead convinced that he's going through a mental health crisis. I read some really good papers on the topic and how he seems to be having a neurotic breakdown, which I'm going, 9 years of an attritional siege war and nothing's happening. You feel like it's going nowhere. Yeah, I think I'd have a breakdown too. I'd have probably had it long before the 9-year mark, but hey. And also because you can't imagine that this guy behaves like a neurotic mess for 9 years or even prior to that. Because you're like, how is this the guy who went and claimed his ancestral seat of Mycenae, had to take it by force, expanded essentially his mini empire, gathered all of these men, came to, like, there's no way anybody would follow this guy if he were like that. That's why I'm convinced, I'm like, this is a mental health crisis this man is going through. And I think it makes total sense, especially when nowadays, in the modern day, we understand a lot more about war and warfare and the effect that it has on people. This is also definitely something that Nolan brought to this film. He goes, yeah, and to be fair, a lot of that is in Homer, but Homer's not talking about the psyche, and he's also focusing on a whole lot of different things. And I think using Agamemnon the way he does, chef's kiss. Yes, I even like the black Darth Vader armor because it makes him seem inhuman. It makes him seem just like this, again, specter of death and destruction. And it is not until you see him in the underworld and you actually see his face kind of within the armor that you're like, oh fuck, he's not some inhuman force. He's just a mortal man who can be killed. And then obviously the big thing is that how Clytemnestra kills him, we take all that armor off. He's just a mortal man. He's just a guy. Yes, he was very powerful, obviously very charismatic, all of these things, but he's just a guy. He's also a guy who did horrible things, and that is a whole tangent into the House of Atreus and a whole lot of problems there. Again, also part of his contrast with Odysseus. But obviously the film is not going to super explore that. You don't have time to, and that would be a distraction away from the Odysseus story. Contrastly, I am left a little uncomfortable with how they've done Menelaus and Helen. Now look, let's lay the cards on the table and be real. The relationship and dynamic of Menelaus and Helen has been debated, analyzed, interpreted in every single way you can imagine since the ancient times. Like, even the ancients kind of didn't know how they were supposed to feel about Menelaus and Helen and what their relationship dynamic was. And that came down to a lot of different attitudes to who did you think was responsible? Like, did Helen go by choice or by force? Or by divine will, which, oh boy, like, would their relationship ever recover? Like, what was their relationship even before then? Look, the ancients have argued this, and that argument and that interpretation continues. And part of my issue with the showing of Menelaus and Helen is I had to sit there and go, is there an objective issue with what he has shown? Or is it just that it doesn't match with my personal interpretation? I think a lot of it was, it doesn't match with my personal interpretation. Where I read Helen in the Iliad and the Odyssey, she has 3 appearances in the Iliad, and obviously her big appearances in the Odyssey, it's really, I think, numbers, I guess, then 2, which is when Telemachus is in Sparta meeting Menelaus and Helen. I see her, especially because I do take the Iliad into account. I think you kind of have to, because that gives you insight into her behind the walls of Troy. This is a woman who we are presented in the Iliad is very clearly basically a POW behind enemy lines. Yes, she's living in palaces and all of that, but she doesn't want to be there. She makes that explicit. She wants to go home. She also feels a sense of guilt and a sense of shame over the fact that she's there. And hold on to those words, guilt and shame. We will come to those. It's very important, obviously, to Nolan's film and reflects an aspect of Greek culture, which is it being a shame society. Helen is a woman who very well knows the narrative that surrounds her. She is aware that essentially everybody thinks of her as a slut. There's a word that she uses in Greek to describe herself, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and that word is kainopis. Now, kainopis literally translates as essentially dog-eyed or dog-faced. It is an extreme insult. It's one of the most insulting things you could call someone because it means you are shameless, but it is a level of shamelessness that essentially, transcends basic human shamelessness. Like, again, you're being described as a dog. Like, you are being so insulted. In fact, Achilles calls Agamemnon kainopis in the first book of the Iliad. So it is a massive insult to throw around. That she throws it at herself, I think, reflects the complicated relationship of guilt and shame. In that guilt is an internal idea. It is something that comes from the inside. Shame comes from the external. That comes from society. Now, in terms of guilt, I think Helen is left in this very uncomfortable situation where we understand in many of the versions, she went with Paris because Aphrodite influenced her to. I describe it as you got divinely roofied and mind controlled. So she could have been in a state of, I'm aware and it feels like I'm making decisions, but ultimately we know Aphrodite is behind it. How much control did she have? It's like blaming the roofie victim for anything she did when she got roofied. And I'm like, that's messed up. And that's awful. And in the Iliad, at one point, you do basically have to watch essay by coercion. It's very short and very brief because even in the Odyssey, where we watch Odysseus get essayed by Calypso, it's very short and very brief. Homer is not going to go into a lot of the nitty-gritty there because obviously, again, these are being performed at religious festivals and everything else. That would be wildly inappropriate. But she feels this sense of guilt being like, I still went and did this thing. Yes, a god influenced me, but I still did this thing. And she's also then aware that everyone on the outside is going to be like, oh, she ran off with him. What a hoe. And so she has an immense sense of shame related to that. But in the Iliad, she's still doing her best, even in this horrendous kind of unprecedented political situation where rather like Penelope and Ithaca, she has to use all of her kind of political cunning to survive behind the walls of Troy and keep herself in good with Priam and the royal family because that's the only protection she has right now. At the same time, she is trying to express and hold on to and put forth her own actual perceived sense of self and identity, which is extremely difficult, and she has to be extremely subtle and clever about it. Again, look, Helen is not stupid. She's incredibly smart. And this is why I often make the joke that Homer went, ugh, Greek queens, am I right? They're so smart. Put them in a tough spot, holy shit. And that's also understanding these women are operating under far more constraints than the men because they are women. They are very limited in what they're able to do. And oh my gosh, Penelope and Helen make use of it. Now, there are people who will argue the complete opposite of Helen, who will argue different interpretations of Helen. And you can't say it's invalid because this is us digging into text and doing analysis and interpreting. And that's where I say I'm most interested in Helen and Menelaus and how he was going to do that because it's really going to be Nolan's interpretation of the translation of the Odyssey that he read, which I do understand was Emily Wilson's. And Emily Wilson has choices she makes. A lot of them I don't agree with. Now, it was made very clear. He gave interviews and I saw them later. I went in trying to go know as little as possible about how he interpreted things. That he said, if you think of the face, Helen very famously gets called the face that launched 1,000 ships. Thank you, Christopher Marlowe. He goes, how could she come back? How could that marriage between her and Menelaus be happy? How could it be anything other than kind of filled with a lot of resentment and pretty unhappy, which I do think you get. And part of the problem is also that we only get very small glimpses of Menelaus and Helen in Sparta in the film. And to be fair, we don't get massive glimpses of them in the Odyssey, but they play out in longer segments and they're dealing with a lot of different things because again, you can do a lot more in an epic poem than you can do in a film because an epic poem doesn't have a time constraint. Unlike a film, I think the film does show us that these are two people who are very damaged, as we'll say, very traumatized. Obviously, the war has done damage to both of them. But I had a hard time getting a gauge on what exactly their relationship was because I saw resentment and anger, but there were other little moments where I'm like, what am I supposed to read into that? Of course, obviously, Nolan has said, no, I meant it to be filled with resentment. I'm like, I can't argue that that's not fair and not a valid interpretation. He wouldn't be the first one to say that. And I do think that, yeah, this is an effective trauma. The public way in which Menelaus kind of manhandled Helen in front of Telemachus and the character of Mentor, who I was kind of glad to see a lot of them in here. That was kind of cool. As played by the great actor who also played Gary Bertier in Remember the Titans. I was a little surprised by that. Even more so, I was surprised by the scarring on her face. That genuinely shocked me. And here's why. Helen is very famously a daughter of Zeus. No one would do that. Now, they might kill her. Don't get it twisted. She's genuinely afraid that if she loses favor in the royal Trojan family, she knows the common person of Troy probably hates her. And they definitely shame her. She's considered of low moral standing with all of them. And she can genuinely worry that the Greeks might kill her. In fact, Aphrodite threatens her in book 3 of the Iliad to force her to leave the walls of Troy, where she's gone to watch a duel between Menelaus and Paris, and after Aphrodite whisks Paris away because that motherfucker absolutely would have been killed. She says, Helen, you should go find Paris. He's waiting for you. And she's like, what? No. She's like, absolutely not. And Aphrodite has to threaten her. And she says, I will make the Trojans and the Greeks hate you. And she's like, I mean, hate you to they will want nothing more than to kill you. So that should you find them, no matter basically how this war ends, you're dead. She threatens her. And a woman who has at this point been behind enemy lines for 10 years and is clearly aware that the only people who are polite and kind to her are Priam and Hector, and she says that explicitly in the Iliad, nobody could survive a threat like that, and coming from a god. It just adds even more the force that she's under. She is essentially a pawn, a plaything, an object to these characters. And another thing that also makes me sad about how Nolan interpreted Helen and Menelaus is that Helen is objectified by basically every character in the Iliad who speaks about her. She is objectified by the gods, by the Trojans, even by like a random Trojan like messenger. He doesn't even refer to her by name. It's so terrible. The one character who doesn't objectify her is Menelaus. To be fair, Menelaus does not speak a lot in the Iliad, but he never speaks of her as an object. He doesn't really speak much of her at all, which again allows you to read into the interpretation that she could be almost inconsequential to this, and this has to do with the damage to his perceived honor or reputation, whatever have you. Again, all of these interpretations are perfectly valid because it's how you're reading this text. And that's where you get into the murky waters of how does somebody want to interpret it. But at the same time, she is a daughter of Zeus. It's one of the most famous parts of her mythology. Nobody would leave her disfigured like that. I understand what Nolan is going for, and it's pretty clear he has eliminated the idea of anybody being related to a god who is human. Obviously, we keep Polyphemus, but he's a creature and a monster. So, you have to move that existing in a different sphere. The humans, there is clearly nothing that is being done to link the idea that they are related to gods, which is the only way I could mentally square the idea of somebody disfiguring Helen's face like that and not thinking it would fuck them up later. Look, Zeus doesn't usually give that much of a shit about his human children. You could never get away with an insult like that. So I found that a case of I can't argue with it on an objective level. Subjectively, I wish it were a little different. Although I will say I did love how John Bernthal as Menelaus brings this very intense presence to Menelaus. I mean, look, let's be real. Menelaus, Lord of the War Cry, he is frequently called, which designates him as a guy who would fight on the front lines and was a good commander and a brilliant fighter because you had to shout your commands across the battlefield. So he has a very loud, powerful voice. We know he's intense. I mean, in the Iliad, what lines he has are bangers, and he's very intense, and there's a lot of violence in the Iliad, and obviously, again, we're coming off the sacking of Troy, which was like an apocalypse for that city. It's razed to the ground. This is a man who I think is rather like he is in the Odyssey, trying to come to terms with some of the stuff that he did. In the Odyssey, I mean, when they tried to talk about Troy in Sparta, I can't remember if it's a singer or if Menelaus himself is also telling tales. He does tell some tales, but like there's a very specific moment, I think it's a singer, who starts singing tales of Troy and the sacking of Troy and the horse and all these things. Menelaus breaks down in tears. Like, he's hysterical. He cannot be calmed down. Helen has to go get the, like, ancient, Homeric version of, like, anti-anxiety drugs to essentially calm him down. And Telemachus is also weeping because he's now starting to get a better understanding of what this war means and what it meant to the people who were adults when it began. Because remember, he's a baby when it started. To him, it's just this idea of glory and, remembering his father's name and all of this. Now he's getting a bit more a taste of the human aspect. And I think he's also starting to understand his mother a lot more, which in the Odyssey is important. That's obviously not in Nolan's version. I almost wish we had it, but there is that moment where we do have Menelaus telling the story of the horse, and it is the way he tells it. I will give so much credit to John Bernthal in that he's telling it almost like it's supposed to be a throwaway, but there's so many emotions simmering under the surface of the way he's telling it. And this is a man who does seem kind of haunted by some of the things that he's done, but obviously does not know how to emotionally deal with it. Basically, everyone in the Odyssey needs therapy. They all do. And I'm talking Homer's poem and the film. So I'm left a little like, I don't know how I feel about that. But I can't say it's wrong, and I have to respect that that was how Nolan saw it, and when continuing his exploration of trauma and the effect it also has upon relationships, I can't argue with it objectively or in terms of analysis. It absolutely makes sense. Again, Nolan is bringing both what he clearly saw in the Odyssey, which again, there is so much an exploration of trauma in the Odyssey. It can feel like it takes a back seat to a lot of other things, but it's there, and he dialed in and lasered in on it, and also brought a more modern understanding that we have of what war does to the people involved in it, which I thought was a great angle to take for the Odyssey. It really dials you in on the human element of it, amidst all these monsters and everything else. And so I guess we can go through the adventures of some of the other adventures and moments of Odysseus. The big one being, I'm sure a lot of people thought I was gonna flip my lid at the fact that we do not have the infamous Altis trick, the no man trick, when it comes to Polyphemus. Look, I was very excited for the Polyphemus encounter. It's one of the most iconic moments of the Odyssey, and the Altis trick is absolutely a part of it. But here's the thing. With the focus that Nolan has taken on very much dialing in on human trauma and grief and the effect of war and structuring this film in like these 3 acts through the stages of grief, the Altis moment becomes way less important. You would only put it in to do like a cheeky wink to the audience. And totally, I don't think that would fit. I don't know if the trick would actually work with the way that Nolan structured the film and the tone that he took for it. Because the Altis trick, well, again, there is voluminous scholarship on that moment. Like, don't get me wrong, you could start trying to read all the scholarship just on book 9 with Polyphemus, and you would probably be dead before you ever finished. There is just so much on the topic. And let's also be real. In terms of Homer and the epic poem, it is a moment of linguistic mastery that any translator worth their salt will tell you in a translator note cannot be adequately expressed out of the Greek. It's not just that he does the I am no man. Like, yeah, you can translate that bit and show the trick. And Homer does other things with language in that entire segment that blow your mind. Even I cannot fully understand everything he does because you have to get super philological, and I get kind of lost at that point. Like, I do my best, but there are even moments where I go, I'm not entirely sure what we're saying, but all I'm getting is this guy was a fucking genius. It is a moment to show just how fucking clever Odysseus is. It's just absolutely show-off moment. But it also ties into the ethos of the Greek hero. The Greek hero is always chasing this thing called kleos. Kleos, roughly translated as glory or honor. And there's lots of arguments on it. I love to turn people to the work done by Gregory Nadja, who's a professor of classics at Harvard, has this wonderful book called The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours. And the way that he talks about kleos in that, I think, is a great way to make it make sense. You're looking at legacy. It's something you can only achieve truly when you die. You build the blocks for it while you're alive with your deeds and the stuff that you do and your reputation. But it's something you truly only achieve when you die because it's the closest a human mortal will get to immortality. It is, you are remembered. You have a legacy. Your name is sung in songs and continued on. And this idea of singing songs obviously comes through in Nolan's Odyssey. Look at its very beginning with Travis Scott playing the character of Demodocus, who is the singer and bard retelling stories in the Ithacan palace. The Greek hero is always chasing kleos. They will die for this idea. That it features way more prominently in the Iliad, as it also ties into why Agamemnon and Achilles get in a beef with each other, because it has to do with this concept of time, which are like physical manifestations of your ability and your power and your glory. Basically, booty and loot that you took, which reflects how great you are, which will tie into kleos. Them arguing with each other comes down to that. This is deadly serious for the Greek hero. Deadly serious. Again, this is the ethos of how and why they live their lives the way they do, why they do the things that they do and do them in the manner that they do. And in that way, they are also always chasing a perfect death. Because if you die just right, like that song will get sung. And obviously, as you can probably guess, this is tied to your name. Your name needs to be remembered through the ages. So when Odysseus takes on anonymity itself, becomes Altis, no man, I'm nobody, I'm anonymous, I am anonymity itself. He puts all that kleos that he got at Troy at risk. He puts all the chaos of this moment at risk, which is one of the reasons, and for a lot of people, one of the most prominent reasons, you could say he becomes so hubristic and doxes himself to Polyphemus later, because he's realizing, oh my God, what have I done? They need to remember that this was me who did this. I'm the one who did this. My Kleos depends on it. And that's also where you see a shift in the epic poem, where this is a hero whose Kleos is defined by his work at Troy, to a man whose Kleos is going to be defined by the story of the Odyssey, by his nostos, his return home. Now, Nolan is not exploring the ethos of the Greek hero. He's not exploring Kleos. That's fine. Look, it's really important. I would say if he were doing the Iliad, he would absolutely have to focus on that because it's core to why those characters are doing what they're doing. And while it does play a role for a lot of why Odysseus is doing what he's doing and plays a role to a degree with the situation on Ithaca, although obviously Xenia plays an even bigger role there, it's not necessary when you're exploring very narrow and specific, dialed-in focus on trauma. You can make that a result of trauma, which it also absolutely is. His anger is described, and later Telemachus is described the same way when we have the infamous killing of the 12 maids, in that it is a trauma reaction. It's all those things kind of at once. If you try to split the difference and do it all at once, your movie can feel really shallow and unfocused. Again, a film is not an epic poem. An epic poem can do all this. It's a completely different medium. It's 12,000 plus lines in Greek, like told over 24 books. A film doesn't have that luxury, even a film that is 3 hours long. And the fact that Nolan got as much as he did into that film and the way that he structured it, I actually found incredibly impressive. So yes, the no man trick is not there. Do I miss it? Sure, of course I want to see the no man trick on screen. It's fun. That's why we like it. It's fun. But Nolan isn't going for fun. It tonally wouldn't work. He doesn't need it because he's dialed in on trauma, and he can do the trauma response without the whole autist trick, as we see in the film, but even more so. When you're considering the fact that Polyphemus also in the Greek, I mean, again, layers upon layers upon layers, you can do this in an epic poem, is reflecting this kind of fear of the barbaric other. I think Nolan gets that across in the fact that they don't even bother to try to speak to Polyphemus. Because obviously Odysseus immediately is like, I'm trying to chat him up. Let's do Xenia. But they see Polyphemus immediately just go, monster, run. The barbaric other, run. Well, in the cave, you're trapped. And then he eats a man. Would you try to converse with that? Would you assume that thing could converse? Maybe in the modern day we would. Back then to them, that is the barbaric other. All we want to do is survive and get out. Not even going to bother talking with anything else. It hasn't spoken to us. Just assume it doesn't speak. Which is why you then get the great moment, I believe it's Eurylochus who says, oh my God, it talks. It might have been one of his other crew members. I think it might have been Eurylochus. But I can't remember exactly. But Odysseus goes, I mean, do you talk to an ant? And that reflects how they look at him as a monster. He looks at them as food. Oh, nobody considered it could speak. Maybe Odysseus did. But maybe he also then internally realized, no point when this thing is trying to eat us. Which would, again, also reflect he still sees Polyphemus as the barbaric other. The thing that's not worth trying to reason with, because clearly it just wants to eat them. Which, I mean, yeah, Polyphemus pretty much just does in the Odyssey. But you don't need to go through all those lines of, look how clever I am dialogue to achieve that. And also, again, Nolan is very dialed and very focused. The no man trick becomes superfluous to his focus. Could you add it? Yes, but it would be there as self-indulgence. And that self-indulgence would potentially harm his tone and his pacing. Which again, he still keeps them trapped in there for a couple days. But the fact that it could potentially damage his pacing and damage his tone, I understand why it was cut. Yeah, do I wish it was there? Sure. Do I think the movie suffers because it's not there? No, not at all. I actually think the entire segment still works. And again, the work that was done on Polyphemus, I know it was a massive, 60-foot puppet or 30-foot puppet, which of course, obviously, they cleaned up and enhanced with CGI. I thought it was brilliantly done. I saw the influences of the very famous painting, I believe it's by Goya, of Cronus eating his children. Again, there's a lot of fine art references throughout some of the visuals of it. And I thought the Polyphemus encounter was great, even having him then go into the ocean. The screams of Polyphemus is a feat of sound design that alone deserves an Oscar. Because there was a moment when he was screaming. I mean, there's very loud, it's almost like boar, elephant, roar. Like, it's clearly a lot of sounds layered atop each other. But there was one bit of it which my ear could hear, unless it was just my tinnitus acting up, which let's always leave room for that. It almost sounded like high-pitched female screams. And I go, oh, that's screaming. That's Troy. Troy is always still looming and present in the things that happen. Ooh, I heard that. I heard Odysseus hearing that. I thought it was well done. We then move on, of course, to the infamous The Laestrygonians in their armor. I would frankly love a 3+ hour documentary from the production crew to go into the nitty-gritty of the pre-production and the production, mostly talking about why they decided to design things the way that we were. I don't know why they chose to go that route. I would really be curious as to why. But to me, that's not the most important part of that encounter. One, they do find a child. I do believe in the Odyssey, they find the wife of the Laestrygonians, who is also kind of huge. But they are just cannibal giants. I mean, they don't talk. They're just cannibal giants. And you use them to eliminate a whole bunch of Odysseus' ships. It's really why they're there. But the idea that they find a child, okay, we know we're going to link that back to Troy, destruction of children. They're like, hey, no, it's fine. It's like, you can't roll up with all your armor and your swords out and all of that and be like, hey, it's fine. No. But my favorite part of that entire sequence, besides, yes, shout out to the Force perspective, A+ to all the stunt performers, yes, including the gal who was Odysseus' stunt performer with arms like none of us have ever seen before. Absolutely, thank you, I enjoyed the gun show. My favorite moment of that entire bit, which to me I was like, oh, this is so good, is where we see the forest move. Literally, it's like the trees move. And it really disorients you. And at first I was like, oh, that's really cool. I love how this adds to the chaos of the scene. But I loved it even more when the film made it clear they are on Aeaea, which is the island of Circe. Obviously, of course, the Laestrygonians are not in the poem, but when you're streamlining and condensing, sure, put them on opposite ends of a really large island. Why not? Sure. They don't seem to interact with each other and they run parallel to the island. When I realized we were on Aeaea, that moment of the trees moving, seeming to move, and disorienting everybody was brilliant and made even more sense. Because Aeaea as an island, this year he spends on Circe's island, is really disorienting. Because Aeaea, when he goes to Aeaea, it feels just slightly off. I mean, and again, I know that the Scotland was standing in for Aeaea. It should feel not Greek. It should feel very different. So it's a completely strange seeming disorienting landscape. And they say this is really a weird place. And it is sort of like a threshold. It's in this in-between space between the world they know and what will be the underworld. Beyond the world you know, you have to go over the Okeanos, which was the ocean. They believed it was this river that encircled the world. And on the other side, you are well out of the land you know and the sense of reality. And Circe, almost functioning in a kind of shaman-esque way, is that in-between. She is the threshold, the doorway. Now, the descriptions of Odysseus, leaving her island to have to go to the underworld and then coming back, we get this realization that the sun seems to rise and set in different locations in a way that it shouldn't, which does create this very disorienting feel on Circe's island. Now, again, part of the whole disorienting, I say Odysseus is in a funk on Circe's island for a year, even though it seems like that year passes like that. He has confusion on his sense of self. This is tying again into what he did with his Kleos on the Cyclops island and everything else. So you're really locked in that. Obviously, again, we're not exploring the ethos of the Greek hero as it pertains to Nolan's film, so you eliminate the need for a lot of that. So again, I love that we did the moving of the forest to create this disorienting space that what is this place that we're in? And then you get to the bit with the deer. I chuckled to myself at this, and it has nothing to do with Nolan or anything else. It's because when I hosted Odyssey Book Club, when we read that chapter, or that book, which is book 10, there is a moment where he slays a deer while hunting to get food, and everybody panicked, thinking, oh my God, did he just kill a person? Are they committing basically accidentally doing a cannibalism, guys? And I was like, no. It's never implied that that is a person. However, in the case of the film, it's a really good clue because we are eliminating Hermes and Molly, which I think, again, with the way Nolan does the gods, makes sense. It is a moment that is super fantastical, and eliminating it by he killed a deer and then he realizes he's killed a person makes his ability to confront Circe more grounded, but still fantastical. Look, we're still turning people to animals. The realm of the fantastical is there. So he then is like, where the fuck is everybody? This is weird. I need to go find them. I'm going up to that hut on the hill. And at first I was like, this is great in that I loved seeing the big cats. One, it's a nod to a lot of, again, classic art that has Circe surrounded by these big cats, because in the epic poem it's described that they see like these big beasts, these lions and and everything else, and they behave weirdly tame. Now part of you could read, is it because those are men who've been turned into animals, or is it just that again Circe has this power that she exerts over them and over this island, really, because Aia of course is its own island. It's not on the island of the Thagonians. Again, we're streamlining in the film. I thought that was neat. My one bit of was the design of her home. I mean, it looks like old, like almost medieval British sort of like I would imagine this taking place in England, which does make it ironic it's taking place in Scotland. Like it just looks kind of like a kind of rundown, crumbling place. And while I get so much of the film is rather in the way that the Iliad constantly foreshadows the fall of Troy, the film version of the Odyssey here is constantly foreshadowing the fall of the Bronze Age, the fall of this heroic age. Maybe that's what he was going for, but I was a little surprised at kind of how run down it looked. Though I will say the body horror of changing the men to pigs. My feet, like, again, I had a brilliant audience. You felt everybody getting physically uncomfortable in that moment. And as you should, it's horrifying. And again, the way that Eurylochus in the epic poem describes it to Odysseus is horrified. Like, he's horrified, he's terrified, he's freaking the fuck out. So having us feel that viscerally, kudos to you, Nolan. I'm terrified if you ever actually do a horror movie because I don't know if I'd survive. So then we sit down and have that tense standoff between him and Circe. I thought the standoff does achieve great tension. I was wondering how he was going to do it, but we really show Odysseus as highly observant. Again, he's wicked smart in the Odyssey. I mean, he's cheeky levels of smart. And of course, he goes in with the kind of arrogance of knowing he's got Molly and Hermes on his side. So you're just waiting for the inevitable. There was a moment of, is he going to realize stuff? But then we realize as the audience, Odysseus has been observing everything the entire time. He already clocked that, hey, maybe these are my men. Maybe something has happened to them, obviously. And he clocks the ring in the bowl. He clocks how Circe interacts with that bird. And now the story of the bird being the sister, this is a Nolan invention. Obviously, Circe has quite a few siblings. Most of them are extremely famous. None of them are turned into a bird. So, yeah, none of them are turned into a bird. That's fine. I get it. It's a convenience he had to make because he's eliminating Hermes and Molly and how he's doing the gods, which I will say, again, I love how he did the gods overall. It's probably one of my favorite envisionings of how a Greek myth film adaptation has done the gods. They still feel very present. They feel like forces of nature. And so I'm fine with that. The one thing I was still kind of meh about was Circe. I call it the Madeleine Millerification of her. This feels more like Circe out of Madeleine Miller than it does Circe out of the Odyssey. And look, again, I'm very to me, Circe is like a 3-star book. It's fine. I like it. I like a lot of parts of it. I don't like other parts of it. It's fine. Madeleine Miller's interpretation of Circe, her version of Circe, has influenced a lot of people. And while I see, again, what Nolan was doing, it certainly follows thematically with stuff he has already set up in the film at that point. I don't love it. And that's fine. I loved the transformation into pigs. I was fine with their standoff. The idea that Circe is just the how dare men have done this. I'm like, bitch, Circe has just chilled out on that island, since the Titanomachia. Very few people come to visit her in mythology. How would she know or care? That's sort of my one thing. But other than that, I mean, I will say I think Samantha Morton's performance is phenomenal. And again, the scene does work in the film. It wasn't my favorite of the interpretations. And that just is personal taste. Again, this is that's very, for me, subjective analysis. I still think it functions in the film and it does fine. It's not my favorite interpretation of the character. I was really more surprised at how they designed her home more than anything else. And I would love to hear the behind the scenes on the thought process of that. The underworld is one of the most incredible moments in the film. It looks astonishing. Using that black sand beach in Iceland, which I know they literally actually buried the performers and they had snorkels going up so they could breathe, the look of everybody, the fact that they kept the sacrifice, the dirtiness of the sacrifice. And like, we talk about the sacrifice and I'm like, dude, this would have been gross. I mean, you're killing sheep, you're leaving their blood. It's nasty. There is an element of body horror even to that, and the grotesque, I should say, to that. Well done. And this is where we bring in Sinon. Sinon has already been seen, and Sinon is obviously an inclusion to the Odyssey. He is not in the original poem. His most famous appearance is in the Aeneid, as written by Virgil. And you have to really understand what Virgil was doing to also understand why Sinon is presented as he is in the Aeneid. Now, yes, I am aware in the film they pronounce it Sinon. It should be pronounced Sinon, but they also say Menelaus as opposed to Menelaus. I wasn't that bothered by it. I was sort of like, oh, okay, we're going to pronounce it like that. I'll have to move on, kind of thing. Using Sinon to express the idea of shame and expressing him as a sort of manifestation of all that Odysseus has done, as well as tying it to the Antinous story, I thought was really clever. Greece is often analyzed as what is called a shame culture. And again, shame is something that comes from the outside. Obviously, the community looks at you for what you have done and you feel shame. You feel ashamed because the community is looking at you that way. And we do know later on in ancient Greece, the mark of essentially whether or not you were a good person was, could you feel shame? Because if you didn't feel any shame, again, remember that word, kainopis, which essentially means shamelessness, is one of the most insulting things you can call someone. If you can't feel shame, you're not a good person. Which ties to the Antinous story beautifully, because is he shameless? Oh my God, yes. Is that played wonderfully in the film? And using Sinon as a vehicle for that? Amazing. Now, Sinon in myth is said to be a cousin of Odysseus. While he was definitely mentioned and in the mythic tradition, before Virgil, a Roman poet writing a Roman epic, wrote the Aeneid. We don't know too much about him. Obviously, his most famous version of him is in the Aeneid. And you have to know that the Aeneid is, in terms of mores and ethos, very different from the Iliad and the Odyssey, because the Romans took great pride in like how pious they could be. And it was, it's why I make a joke about if Odysseus ever says he did wrong with the Trojan horse, I'm like, what is this Roman propaganda? Because Virgil rips into the Greeks. Yes, he's taking the Trojan viewpoint because they believe themselves as descended from Aeneas, who was a warrior at Troy. So obviously they're going to be pretty staunchly anti-Greek. And they didn't think, a lot of Romans at that time kind of looked at Greek going, great culture, great all of these things. It goes, shame that they're Greek. Like, damn, they really had beef with the Greeks in that regard. It was like, oh, shame about the Greeks. Love their art. It's like, guys. It makes me think of the bit from Braveheart where it's like, the trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. Like, that's sort of the view they took of Greece, even though they just appropriated all their shit. And so Sinon is this very conniving, devious character in the Aeneid. He knows the Trojan horse is a trick, and that's part of what his job is. Presenting it in the film is he fully believed in the trick, so he could sell the sincerity of it, which adds to Odysseus' sense of guilt. And then we learn this backstory that Nolan creates, the idea of drawing lots. Now, Odysseus and his crew do draw lots between each other in various encounters of the Odyssey, so I could see maybe that's where he got the idea of we have to draw lots among the men of Ithaca. And we see that initially Antinous was supposed to go, but then he tried to trade it with Sinon, and so then Sinon ends up going, and he's so young, so young, and how Sinon becomes this moment of Odysseus feeling guilt. He becomes this manifestation of Odysseus' guilt over pulling a trick, of essentially inventing a new way of warfare, which killed a lot of people. And then this physical manifestation of Antinous' shame for his cowardice, which he goes, I feel no shame. I don't know what you're talking about. We're just like, kind of peace. You dog-faced bitch. Done well. So having Sinon in the underworld, the way with Tiresias, I already talked about Agamemnon. The underworld is spectacular. It's a spectacular moment. It is so moody and eerie, and it was one of, again, my favorite moments.
Leaving the underworld, we of course come to the Sirens and Charybdis and Scylla. I think the Sirens is one of the most powerful sequences, and it's one that really made me think of Homer. So the Sirens in the Odyssey, obviously we hear what they're saying because Odysseus is the one telling the story, and he talked about how they say, we'll sing to you of your exploits at Troy, like of what a great hero you were. You know, all these things that, again, the Greek hero chases. Now, Nolan makes the, I think, bold and like absolutely perfect decision
to keep the sirens silent, in that we don't hear them. Obviously, we know Odysseus does. And for a film that I saw an interview with Tom Holland, and I thought this was a really interesting way to say it. He said, he was really glad he'd done a play before filming the Odyssey, because he goes, theater acting is different than film acting. I think we can all agree, we all know that. But that film acting is different than IMAX acting, because you're thinking about how the camera is so big and the screen is going to be so huge, and it is so attuned to every detail it catches on screen that even the smallest movements and the smallest things feel big. So if you go really over the top, it can sometimes almost feel like, I would assume, sort of like psychotic pantomime, right? So he was really conscious of, if I go big, it has to be, if you go big, you have to be tempered, and you have to know when to go big and when to use that to your advantage. But that if you try and go big all the time, it'll end up looking kind of ridiculous on screen, which I thought was an interesting way to think about it. I hadn't considered that. I mean, I knew filming in IMAX is difficult. I remember watching some stuff on the filming of Oppenheimer, and they talked about how, you have to do the makeup differently. You have to be really careful because that thing is right in your face, getting like every single bit of your pores and like all that. And I'm going, that actually makes a lot of sense. But in here, we see Matt Damon going full force. I mean, that man is screaming his lungs out. He is screaming his throat out. He is going big. And what I loved is it's an almost kind of, what's the word? It's passion, and that passion can be both very positive and very negative. I think there's an almost euphoria, a desire, and then just like a pain. And it was one of the most powerful things in the fact that I think it's Eurylochus, or I think that he's saying like, what did they, they ask, what did they say to you? And it's like, they told me, they basically tell you like of all the thing that you want most, and realizing it's the thing you can never have, which for me, I think in a film that's toning down the kind of loquacious trickster elements to Odysseus, which we're in a completely different medium. Like, of course, Odysseus is this really kind of chatty Cathy trickster, and a lot of his intelligence, we'll say, is shown especially in how he speaks, and even more so in Greek. Again, like the linguistic gymnastics that Odysseus does with, like the stuff he does with language. One, I think, can never be properly translated out of ancient Greek, but it's also, when you're talking about an epic poem and an epic poet, all they have is language. There are no visuals. There's nothing you can show, right? It's all about the language. In a film, you can do things differently. And I think it's the fact that we have Odysseus realizing that, like, this is the thing you want most, but also coming to that conclusion and understanding that it's the thing maybe you don't want anymore, and that you never wanted it in the first place. Or we're seeing the character develop through his stages of trauma and grief, and like trying to come to terms with what he's done. Like, yeah, I want to hear the stories of the exploits of Troy. Every Greek hero would want to hear their exploits. And again, in the context of the Odyssey, the Otis trick, and Polyphemus and Kleos, and all of these things, and how it pertains to the Greek hero, the sirens are playing on that. They're offering him the chance to basically take a step backwards in character development. But Nolan uses it in the same way that Odysseus does. He moves forward. Now, Odysseus, of course, is screaming, let me go, I want to chase this thing. Sure, you want to go into the comfort of the thing that you know. But you're having to come to terms with the fact that that's not you anymore. You're not that person anymore. And in the case of Nolan's Odyssey, I mean, the haunting score of Ludwig Göransson, who I think did a masterful job with these, reconstructing ancient instruments and all of these sounds and everything else. It was such a beautifully, seemingly minimal, haunting score. And in that moment, it was like, I had chills running up my arm, and I was really emotional, because to me, I was like, it's different than Homer, but it still feels like Homer, because it's like, yeah, you caught it. That I get. That him realizing, like, yeah, I want that thing because I want to feel that comfort of knowing who I am, but I don't know who I am anymore, and I won't know really until I'm home. Which, if you look at Odysseus as a journey of identity, which again has absolutely been analyzed, I think you give me the flavor of Homer there. And of course, we lose one of our crew members, and all of that being done with, dropping the sound out. It's such great filmmaking. And to me, I thought that was a brilliant way to do the sirens. And it felt like, yes, it's different, but to me, it still kind of felt like Homer. Because I was like, especially, I mean, yeah, sure, I know what they're singing to him, but the way the film explains it as well, I was like, ooh, that's fucking good. Then we move to Scylla and Charybdis. The big whirlpool. Insane. Completely bonkers. Scylla, the design is sort of like, it's there. I mean, I didn't think I was going to get like a top half woman, bottom half you know, snarling dogs with like long noodle necks and shit. Like, I didn't expect I was gonna get a, we'll say, mythologically accurate Scylla. I was like, I bet it'll be slightly more serpentine. I honestly couldn't get a really good gauge of what it looked like. Like, except for when it was coming back in and it was camouflaged, it looked a lot like the rocks. I didn't really have an opinion. The only thing I really liked about the sequence was how really rapid it was. How it just kind of smacked out of nowhere, grabbed the guys, caused absolute terror, and then dipped. And I was like, yeah, because that's the thing about Scylla, is that it's really quick and it's startling, especially when you don't know what's happening. And the way we use that to push Eurylochus, because obviously the men, Odysseus' men in general, are kind of shown to be pretty unruly the whole way through. They're constantly disobeying him and doing all sorts of things. You're like, oh my god. I mean, again, if as Odysseus is telling the story, he's setting you up for when they're going to do the mutiny. In this case, what we're seeing with Eurylochus, which again, I do think it's smart to center somebody like Eurylochus as sort of a mouthpiece for the crew in a way, in the same way that Antinous is a really good center point for the suitors. Using Eurylochus absolutely makes sense. I was kind of bummed we didn't mention that he is in fact Odysseus' brother-in-law. I'm like, damn, I wish we could have mentioned that somewhere. And the actor, I believe his name is Himesh, amazing. Oh my god, so good. I was really, I mean, he does such a great job. I mean, again, I think all of the actors are extremely well chosen. This kind of erosion of faith that he has in Odysseus, where, and in the same way that everybody's going through a journey, they're all kind of getting chipped away at as the journey goes on. And seeing that be the point where Eurylochus is like, why didn't you tell us? And Odysseus says it wouldn't have mattered, basically. Like, there's no moral reason Odysseus doesn't tell them. He's like, he did also trick Eurylochus. He's like, I'm gonna make him think we're gonna sail through Charybdis, which I thought they were, you know, was kind of a fun way for people who know the Odyssey to play on the idea that he does kind of try to skirt real close to Charybdis. He tries to have it both ways and fails dramatically, obviously. That we have him play into that expectation of, oh, he's really going to try that. Oh, shit. And then, of course, he doesn't. And, you know, the crew basically says, no, we're not gonna. And you end up in Scylla. And Odysseus revealing that, like, I knew if I said, let's try Charybdis, you guys would be like, fuck that. We're going through Scylla. I think that's quite clever and shows that Odysseus, in terms of his intelligence in the film, is through observation, understanding kind of people and their behavior. I mean, he's been on the boat with these guys for how long? They were at war for 10 years. Like, he's kind of figured, like, if I tell them we'll do this, they're not going to want to do it, so they'll go the other way, and we'll go the route that will get us to survive. I think that's done well. And then we hit Helios's cattle, and this is where there was one major mythological mistake in the film that had me like, how did this mistake happen? How did nobody clock this mistake? And then I had to also ask, and somebody will have to confirm this to me from what I've understood. Now, we know that Nolan uses Emily Wilson's translation, this translation that I actively despise, because she forced herself to keep all the line numbers the same and go in iambic pentameter. From what I understood, I think she frequently calls these the sun god's cattle. And she may or may not even specify that it's Helios. Which, if you know Greek mythology, it's fine. But if you're one of the people who don't even know about Helios and you just hear sun god and you go Apollo, you end up in this film where for most of the time we just say the sun god's cattle. I was like, that's fine. Call him the sun god. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly accurate. That's fine. Doesn't bother me at all. I don't need him name dropped. That's fine. And then at some point somebody says Apollo and I was like, oh, my eyebrows went up so fast. I was like, who the fuck made that mistake and didn't clock it? It's not even just that the mistake was made, but it's that nobody clocked it. Which makes me think, in her translation, someone will have to confirm this for me, she just calls it the sun god's cattle and never specifies that it's Helios. Granted, Helios appears in the narrative, but depending upon how she's translated it, you still may not realize what's happening. Again, I really do actively dislike her translation. And I don't recommend it to people for many reasons. And I'm like, no, it's Helios. The whole point is Helios, after Odysseus narks on his men and one of Helios's daughters hears this and goes and tells Helios, he goes to Zeus and says, I will take my chariot that drives the sun and I will drive it to the underworld where I don't usually shine and I won't come back. That's his big threat. Now, granted, Zeus was going to help him out anyway, but, you know, that was the big threat. I loved that we kept the idea that they land on the island and it's like, it was fine. until we were stuck there for like a month and we were running out of supplies. And it's desperation. And the idea of like, did you think if you were quiet, the sun god wouldn't hear? I think he's at that point he says Apollo, and I'm like, no, I'm like that the sun god wouldn't notice. And I was like, ooh. And the fact that they say we would rather take our chances drowning than die of starvation here. I mean, that's very much an attitude that you catch in the poem, that they are that desperate. Now, granted, in the poem, they also try and do like a kind of makeshift sacrifice, but the whole idea is they don't have the correct materials to do it, because you're supposed to use like barley and very specific things when you do a ritual sacrifice. They don't have any of the correct materials because, again, they're out of supplies. And so it's a false ritual. Like everything about it is wrong. You know it's not going to end well. And even Eurylochus, when he talks about it, he's just like, maybe if we're lucky. And you're just like, God, it's desperation that's speaking. And it comes to just pure desperation. And that they do it while Odysseus is asleep is kind of like, damn. And I thought that was beautifully done, which moves us right into the storm sequence, which was terrifying. Again, this is where it is okay for me to not be able to see much, where you're using the lightning to light the scene, because that's part of the dramatic effect. That storm sequence was terrifying. Absolutely petrifying. I was like, oh my God. And you understand why they don't maybe want to sail at night or not, in sight of a coastline, and why this was so terrifying. And the way that Poseidon is used, I mean, they say that like every little thing that went wrong on the sea was attributed to Poseidon's wrath. And I go, I like that. Because even if I'm not seeing Poseidon himself, or he doesn't have a voice or anything, the sea is Poseidon's voice. And what I like even more is you feel that these people believe. The gods are what they need them to be. They depend upon them when, like, as almost like fallbacks for when shit's going wrong or when shit's going well, which psychologically in a modern context, we understand to a degree, like, yeah, that's why everything is so tied to nature, and like you're trying to make sense of shit that you can't explain, because obviously certain levels of science they haven't reached yet. I loved that, and it was so powerful. It was so just like, holy fuck me, yeah. That's brutal. And the fact that the shit breaks apart and he's alone on one bit and the men, I was like, that's brutal. That's so brutal. And I loved it. I loved it. At which point we come to Calypso, who was going to be I was admittedly a little concerned, because I think the treatment of Calypso for some people is apparently just a really difficult dance to do. And maybe that comes from attitudes towards, can men be sexually assaulted? Is she a sexist character? Like, again, you can have all of these arguments and these things, and many things can be true at once, but like, let's be real up front. The only case of sexual assault that we see in the Odyssey is Calypso to Odysseus. We know it's been happening for the 7 years he's trapped on our island, but we, in a very brief moment, because look, in the few, we will say on page, on camera moments of SA that occur in Odyssey and even in Iliad, those moments are extremely brief. They are not gone into detail, because you have to remember these are being performed at religious festivals. Like, they're not going to talk about that shit at religious festivals. It's not going to happen. And even in the Greek, this is made supremely clear that Odysseus is unwilling and Calypso is. Odysseus doesn't want to sleep with her, but she exerts that last bit of power and force as a goddess to make it happen. Now, obviously in the film, we have toned down the elements of the gods and their power if you're seeing them in person. Zeus is very much the thunder rumbles and the lightning. Poseidon is the sea. We'll talk about Athena in a bit, because I don't want to say anything until the end, because the way Athena is used is like this interesting ambiguous question mark. But like Circe and Calypso, I mean, Circe, oof, man, again, the body horror of that scene just still hits me deep. Calypso, it's left very vague, kind of what power, if any, she has, like what it is. Now, her name, if I recall correctly, in Greek has something to do with like being able to hide or to shroud. And the whole idea is that she tends to shroud her island kind of in mists and hide it so that mortals can't find it. Which adds to the idea that she shrouds Odysseus on the island for 7 years so that no mortals can ever find them. We hear about this a bit from Menelaus, and the only people who are going to be able to penetrate through that are gods. Now, obviously, in Homer, it is Hermes who rolls down and does this and says, hey, you need to let him go. Calypso throws a massive temper tantrum, being like, you don't let goddesses have any fun. And he's like, okay, bitch, this is an order from Zeus. Zeus on high says, do this, And you don't want to say no because you know what happens when you get a divine order from on high and you say no, which is the only reason she lets him go. Now, the film obviously does not include Hermes' character, which I'm fine with, honestly. And I honestly was not sure if they would or how they would do it if they did. I'm perfectly fine with Hermes not being there. Instead, Nolan uses audio cues, which is we hear thunder rumble. When it's pretty clear Odysseus is doing what he does, which is even while he is under the influence of the lotus, he's still almost like a zombie in a way. Or as I say, they say the body keeps score. The body remembers. Even if, maybe your mind has locked away a memory, your body will still react to things. It's when you're talking about trauma. He still picks up the broken pieces of his ship. He still takes the same kind of route. So even though his mind has been blocked and his memory has been blocked and locked away, his body still does these things. She knows. She knows he wants to go home. She even says later, like, you call out a name in your sleep. Penelope. He calls out for his wife. She knows he wants to go home, but she selfishly refuses to allow him the choice. She takes away his autonomy, which I think any woman would recognize, like, that is so messed up. I mean, we don't stand for that at all. And the only reason she starts weaning him off of Lotus, which obviously kind of wipes your memory and keeps you in this sort of glazed state of false happiness, is because she hears the thunder rumble. And it's on a seemingly clear day. So it's clearly a sign from Zeus saying, bitch, let that Ithaca man go. Let him go. He has to go home. Again, we know Ithaca's at a tipping point. Athena's involved in this, but I don't need to see all the behind the scenes of that. The rumble cue is more than enough for me to go, yeah, that's Zeus putting down an order. That's Zeus exerting his presence. And presence is very important. Like oppression, power, force is the word that comes to mind. Bia is, I believe, the word in Greek usually described as like force. Like your will. And Zeus's will is very much its own thing. And that's him exerting his will on her. And she kind of looks up at the sky, and that's when she starts slowly, begrudgingly, kind of letting him off the lotus. It is very halting and begrudging at first, and you have to get more rumbles for her to keep going. Like, Zeus has to be like, don't even play me, let him go. And it's all very subtle. But what I appreciated again is that it's very clear Odysseus' current state on ODYSSEY, which is her island, is not choice. She has made the choice for him. She does not care about what he wants, and it is not until Zeus sends a big old rumble from on high to be like, you have to knock this off, that she even starts to let him off the lotus. And as for the lotus, I kind of wondered if we were gonna do the Lotus Eaters at all. But the way it was incorporated in the Calypso storyline, I actually found very interesting. It plays with this idea of memory. I think it also could be a play upon, I mean, I don't know how much Christopher Nolan knows about her name meaning like hidden or like to shroud and obscure. She's kind of obscured his memory. She's obscured who he is. He has to rediscover himself. So it is a journey of identity in that way at the same time. And I know I've actually talked to some friends who didn't totally love the exact nature of the nonlinear narrative in Nolan's film. Like, obviously Homer is nonlinear, but the story of the journey is pretty straightforward. There's like a couple moments where it breaks because Odysseus is talking to the Phaeacians, but they're very minimal breaks. The film obviously intercuts a lot more, and I'm okay with that because, again, he's following a thematic through line, and so the intercuts help with the theming. But realizing that he's eating lotus, I appreciate that it was blue because I have heard that there is a plant. A lot of people speculate, like, what's the lotus that the lotus eaters eat actually in the Odyssey. I have heard there's apparently something called like the Egyptian lotus or the blue lotus that might have kind of like psychotropic, tendencies to it, or like effects. That's the word I'm looking for, psychotropic effects. So I wonder if that was a nod to that, but also it was very startling, pretty blue. I did like it. I thought that was an interesting combination, and I went, when you're streamlining the narrative and you're very, in my opinion, very understandably cutting out the Phaeacians, but you also want to keep the nonlinear narrative and the idea of a story within a story, you do need to find a reason for him to tell the story. Who is he talking to? Having him tell it to Calypso while he's rediscovering himself and his memory and basically shedding all of her oppressive force from him. Framing it with the lotus, I thought was actually, that's actually a good move. That's actually an interesting move. Because also, in terms of study of the importance of the Greeks, the idea of community, like even the whole idea of the Greek hero, when they hit that moment of Aristeia and they do these incredible, seemingly superhuman feats, or they reach an almost godlike status, they have to be able to come back down to the human, to the community, right? For example, in the Iliad, Achilles, the pinnacle of his wrath comes in books like 20 to 22 when he finally takes the field and he's just out of his mind. He's reached a point that's inhuman, because he even tells Hector, like, I'm gonna cut out your heart and eat it. He's threatening cannibalism. He doesn't allow the body to be properly treated and buried. Like, he does these things which to them are inhuman. And we're not at superhuman anymore, we're at inhuman. And it's not until Priam comes and begs for his son's body that is able to kind of come back down and realize what he's done and be like, yes, I will now return to the community, return to the human, and let you do this. In this way, we're having Odysseus return to who he is, return to the community. He's no longer in this weird stasis, in the same way that Ithaca is in a weird stasis and needs to return to moving forward. I think using the lotus and the sense of memory and identity, remember who you are, like kind of Mufasa coming down from the clouds moment. To me, that's very interesting. And I find it fascinating. And in terms of streamlining the story, because again, you have to, even when you're pushing a runtime like 3 hours, which truly is your limit to push for a film, that's actually really clever streamlining and really clever conflation. And the way it was used made sense, and the way that the non-linear narrative worked. To me, it worked. I know I have some friends who thought it intercut it a little too much, and I'm like, we're at personal preference. That's personal preference. Maybe you do or don't like it. We have him then out on his raft. It's like, you need to accept your punishment. The idea that you need to accept this. Obviously, we've cut the character of the nymph who comes and saves him and whatever have you. We just kind of leave it, and you just fade to black. And it's left really ambiguous. Like, damn, how did that guy survive? How did that guy survive? Will of the gods, dumb luck. That's something that's left very ambiguous in the Nolan film. And in general, a lot of the stuff related to the gods is left very ambiguous. So then I want to come to Athena. Athena, played by Zendaya, who just looks beautiful in the film. I mean, she is beautiful. Who's shocked? That she has some great moments with Odysseus. And the fact that he's the only one who sees her is, one, kind of fitting, and that usually there's only, like, if a god is by your side, you might see them, they might allow you to see them, but it doesn't mean everybody else does, and they might appear in disguise to others. In this case, nobody sees her when she's next to him, which I think should have been the first clue that this is really ambiguous of, is this even Athena? Because other gods would have known she's there. They would see her, right? You can shroud yourself from other humans, but the only thing that really can shroud you from other gods is something like Hades' infamous, like, helm of invisibility. Gods can see through each other's tricks, right? So the fact that someone like Calypso does not see Athena when they're on Calypso's island, to me, was the first going, like, I made a little note of, like, what is that here? And now Athena does have some great lines of, like, where she's like, oh, you think you're the sole person responsible for the ultimate what's coming, collapse of the Bronze Age, of how the world is all changed, all that. She goes, that's pretty like, isn't that like your hubris? Isn't that your arrogance? That's pretty fucking hubristic. It is, actually. I mean, when you look at the history, the collapse of the Bronze Age is due to many factors. Many, many, many factors. Sure, the Sea Peoples are one factor, and again, we call them the Sea Peoples in scholarship. The name has sort of stuck, but there are all these disparate tribes who were not related to each other. Some of them are even questioned to be, are they the Achaeans that Homer spoke of, the name he gave to these Greeks? So again, Nolan plays on that. It seems that there was really bad drought. So never take out of context climate change and everything else that just sort of conspires together to lead to something ultimately collapsing. And sure, we could talk about how the phrase, our age of bronze is ending, is a little on the nose. It's a bit on the nose. Like, it's a bit on the nose. Let's be real, it's on the nose. But that Athena ultimately is left super ambiguous until we have the beautiful scene of Odysseus still kind of in his beggar disguise, which is mostly he's keeping his face really shrouded, which is smart. Talking with Penelope, explaining Troy, and we get the final rest of the flashback to the fall of Troy. The fall of Troy has kind of been segmented throughout the film, but here we get the climax of it, and the big thing is going into the Temple of Athena. Somebody clearly beheads the statue, but also there's a priestess who is in, a very good moment of parallel editing, clearly also killed, likely beheaded. I would wonder, and while she's not mentioned in the Odyssey, and even this whole incident is never mentioned in the Odyssey, there's an infamous moment during the fall of Troy that's detailed where Cassandra, the princess of Troy, who is also a prophet, who is cursed to never be believed. So a priestess in a way, if you will, runs into the temple of Athena and tries to grasp at what is called the Palladium, which is this statue, this idol of Athena that's there. I don't really know if we know exactly how big it is. It could be a big statue, it could be a smaller statue, whatever, statue of Athena. And she's kind of trying to basically say, if you think like sanctuary, like give me sanctuary and like don't kill me because, you know, I'm on this. And Oilean Ajax, also known as Ajax the Lesser, Little Ajax. Now, Oilean is a patronymic. His father is Oileus. Hence, Oilean Ajax goes in there, pays no heed to her, and assaults her in the temple. It's horrifying. This pisses Athena off. But what pisses her off even more is that she doesn't think Ajax is actually appropriately punished for this. So bad, and this is where you know you done fucked up, Oilean Ajax. She goes to Poseidon and teams up to take down Oilean Ajax. She does also kind of generally give the other Greeks not great winds to sail in. Like, they're kind of fighting the weather when they sail away, but she's really targeted on Ajax, Oilean Ajax, because he's the one who did this. She teams up with Poseidon, explains why she's pissed, and he's like, you know, whose chariot we taken? Now, I say this is, you know, you done fucked up, because Poseidon and Athena, well, they don't hate each other. Most of their tales of them often end with them in a contest with each other. They're kind of on opposite sides. Infamously, the naming of Athens and plenty of other stuff. So, do they get along? I don't know. They're fucking gods. Do gods ever really get along with each other? They're around forever. I think inevitably you do, but they're not always. They're a little contentious at times. But the fact that she goes to him and is just like, help me make this guy suffer, and he's like, down. No problem. He agrees with her. They're down. And mind you, Athena, one of the big two staunchest supporters of the Greeks in the whole Trojan War. Her and Hera were battling for who hated the Trojans more in this moment. Who wanted to see Troy fall the most? Between those two, it's up in the air. Pick your day. What day ending and why are we on? And she goes after him, and he does die at sea, terribly. As he deserves. But I wonder, because it is clear when you're including a character like Sinon, that obviously there was some reading outside of the Odyssey here. Because Sinon is a character who does not appear in the Odyssey or in the Iliad. Again, his most famous appearance is in the Aeneid. So I'm like, okay, there was some reading, obviously, outside of just the Odyssey. And the inclusion of things like the Sea Peoples and whatever, you're not getting that from the Odyssey. I wonder if this was a nod, a kind of, where we would call it almost a screen memory. This is a technique that's used actually in the Odyssey. There's a moment in the Odyssey, this takes place in the court of the Phaeacians, where Odysseus is hearing these tales of Troy from a bard. And he breaks down weeping. And the way he's described, it's like a woman whose husband has died in war and, you know, basically has only, you know, enslavement, whatever, to look forward to. And the screen memory technique is that you would hear this description and the audience listening would immediately know who this is referring to. Even though we're not saying it aloud, we're talking about Andromache. Andromache, who lost her husband Hector, who only has to look forward to being enslaved. We're talking about Troy. Like, that is all very much a screen memory technique. And in this case, I looked at that and went, I'm getting a screen memory technique in film format of Cassandra and the Palladium. And obviously, again, important for this is Odysseus witnesses this. He does not partake in it. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, obviously, he doesn't partake in the essay of Cassandra. And I think that that's the thing that kind of shocks him most, which, I mean, you are playing fast and loose with your ability to stay alive by doing something like that. So, but that he sees, as he says, the 10 years of anger just let loose on the city. And I go, I mean, yeah. These Greeks are angry. They are at their tipping point. I mean, they've been at their tipping point. The Iliad is really like this sort of tipping point. There's a moment where Agamemnon, after getting a very deceptive dream from Zeus, goes and gives, I mean, his version of the locker room speech, we'll say, the halftime speech, except it was clearly done in such a way where this was something that was almost like play acting, or like scripted, where something like this usually followed a format where he goes, woe is us, we should just leave, we're all gonna lose, and what you expect is the army goes, no, coach, we can take them, like, kind of thing. Except in book 2 of the Iliad, he does this. And all of the men immediately start scrambling for their ships. They're ready to get the fuck out of Dodge, even if it means going home in ignominy. They do not care. They're done. Which is shocking to Agamemnon. It's Odysseus who gets them all back. Of Granted, I'm also convinced Agamemnon is going through a severe neurotic break throughout most of the Iliad because his behavior is so erratic. It seems just odd. Regardless, but you understanding, like, these guys were all of them who've been there sieging and waging an attritional siege war for 9 years. We're all ready to pack up and go with nothing to show for it, coming back in defeat, in almost a kind of shame. Those are the people who have now gotten the chance to finally bust through those walls. Yeah, they behave badly. I mean, the sieging of a city is obviously never a pretty thing. And Troy is described, though, in such detail. It is said to be so massive a defeat and such an intense razing and destruction that, yeah, we could say it goes down in the history books. Again, I wonder if there's a kind of folk memory of the burning of the palaces at Mycenae and Pylos. Like, I wonder if historically, if that's where we get the idea of, like, just how catastrophic the death of Troy the city was, which spells doom for Troy the kingdom. That's kind of their crown jewel city. And I thought that was, like, again, we're coming to in terms of the arc of trauma and guilt and grief, that's acceptance. And we get that even when he's on that raft. You have to accept your fate. You have to accept that you're not in control of everything, number one, because it does seem that Odysseus is constantly trying to control things that he can't. That's part of the hubris. I can control this. I've got it. And it's like, no, you don't. And you need to accept that you can't control everything that people do. And you can't control everything that will happen, which is understandably difficult for Odysseus. And even in, I would say, the Odyssey, you get a bit of that. He does the Autis trick, and it's this incredible trick. But then he realizes, oh fuck, I fucked my Cleos, let me wrestle control of that back, and he does the stupid doxing. I mean, it's also this great anger and kind of trauma and stuff that he's blurting it out, but it's wrestling with control and trying to have control and realizing you can't have control if you're playing in the unknown world. I mean, you really can't have control in a world like this. It's a highly unstable world. And again, as I say, trying to understand how the human characters of the Odyssey are functioning, they are trying to make sense of an already unstable world that for the past, at this point, 2 decades, has kind of been in flux. And they don't really have a sense of understanding anymore. And they're trying to wrestle control back. It's why Xenia is so important to them. And that is where, I mean, talking briefly about other stuff on Ithaca, how dare you with the Argos scene, I absolutely was super emotional, and everybody was emotional, and we were all glad that the guy who kicked Argos died first in the slaughter. Yeah, I'm okay. Like, should it be Antinous first? Yes. Am I okay with him being left for last? Sure, it's more dramatic. Am I glad we killed the guy who kicked Argos first? Fuck yeah. My theater was just like, damn right. Damn right. Touch the dog, how dare you. Eumaeus being blind. Interesting choice. It means he's not really available to physically help. I think it does assist where you need to have Odysseus keep a disguise, and we're not having him physically transform the way Athena does it. So if Eumaeus is blind, he can't see him, he can't know, maybe he can guess, but he can't know. The addition of the action scene at Pylos, look, the suitors do plan to kill him, they plan to waylay him, not on Ithaca, because that's super important. The idea, and it all happens off page. We basically get told, Athena rolled up, made sure it didn't happen. It's very anticlimactic. Include a little bit of action, and you bring together the father and son, like that's how they come together. I'm okay with that. That's filmmaking. That's just like, sure, okay. Gratuitous moment action scene, it's fine. Death of Mentor, that hurt. That was brutal, because obviously Mentor does not pass away in the Odyssey. I did like that we got quite a lot of Mentor, and we got to see him training Telemachus in swordsmanship, and that the big thing is not that Telemachus is bad with a sword. He rushes. He charges ahead. He's a little too impetuous. He's younger. He doesn't have that patience, that sort of wisdom that comes with age. I think that makes sense. And the fact that we see it come full circle, and they also say sometimes you have to be willing to be a little tricky. Deliberately expose yourself so then you can get the good shot. It's a little tricky. It's a little bit of a trick. I liked that journey and the way that was set up for you to see the journey of Telemachus, of having to learn to be a little more patient. He can't just be hot-headed, He can't rush. You cannot rush into things. If you rush into things, you end up dead. I'm like, you know what? Solid. And I like we keep that from the sword fighting moving onward. Penelope with the bow, fantastic. And using the musical cue for Odysseus of he plucks the string of the bow. Now this is something that is very much made into a character trait for Odysseus, a little cue that is unique to the film. And one reason I liked it, very nerdy reason, is Odysseus in scholarship is often identified as what is called an Apolline hero. So he's an Apollo-like hero because he is respectful towards and has a lot of the greater qualities that are associated with Apollo. He's a very good archer, right? He is a very good storyteller. So like the bards, which is always accompanied by music, and he's very polite. He behaves well to them. He also has instances where he interacts with priests of Apollo and he pays them proper respect. When he and his men sack Ismaros, he very famously does not do anything to a priest of Apollo and that priest's family. He leaves them be and he's thanked. So he is an Apollon. And even more so, again, if you've been on my channel long enough, you've seen that I went on a whole lore dump about Odysseus's bow, possibly being from Apollo. It's all taking place on a feast day to Apollo. Like, he's an Apolline hero. So I like that little bit, even though the idea of it being like, oh, you have to be honorable and give the warning. I'm like, that's a bit much, but I like it as a musical cue and the links to him as an Apolline hero. In addition, we then come to, infamously, the olive tree bed thing is missing. However, he does carry this little statuette, this little pin of Athena, and they talked about her being surrounded in olive leaves. I'm assuming that's his way of slyly kind of nodding to the olive tree bed, and that also there's a thing that only they would know between them. Like, that's their thing. The olive tree bed is something that's only known between the two of them. So obviously he's nodding at that without including the moment. And let's talk about the ending, which includes the slaughter, which I did enjoy the slaughter. I enjoyed exposing Antinous for the coward that he is. Honestly, again, I loved hating Rob Pattinson in that movie. He really just nailed being such a hateful bastard, and I loved it. I will also say, I love that it's Penelope who locks Melanto out of, like, her private area that keeps her safe. Yes, queen. She's like, I think you want to stay out there with the guy you've been screwing to screw me over. I'm like, no, get it, girl. Get it, girl. Yes. And obviously we've all made jokes about it, but what Antinous just hiding behind a column being like, get the sword, get the spear, get the shields. I'm like, no, honestly, that's funny. And I love it. It feels very satisfying and deserved. And especially then when we consider, I've already talked about like the shame culture and all of that. It's like, you should be fucking ashamed of yourself for behaving that way. I mean, you should already be ashamed, but at least the other guys are fighting. What the fuck, my man? We didn't kill all the suitors, which I did in a very, I wanted in a violently delicious way. We didn't kill them, but they all get on their knees and basically kneel. So, yeah. So it's death or surrender, I guess. He lets them live. The idea that this is something that violates what Nolan calls Zeus's law. And again, this is where I have to look at Emily Wilson's translation and wonder what the fuck did she talk about when it came to Xenia? Because Xenia, it's made very clear, is guesting and hosting. We already talked about this with Troy, how that's why the Trojan Horse is not a violation of Xenia. The big thing is also, and this pertains to like the Polyphemus incident, the Circe incident, all of these incidents where Xenia plays a big role. The big thing is, if somebody violates it, the other person, all bets are off. They can do what they want. The whole thing with Odysseus is, because those suitors have so blatantly and flagrantly violated Xenia in such a way that it's like, are you fucking kidding? All bets are off. Odysseus absolutely has the right to do whatever the fuck he wants, which includes kill them, which is why he kills them. Why Zeus, the god associated with Xenia, is like, absolutely, dude, I'm sending down dramatic thunder for you, which we did get in the movie. The dramatic thunderclap made me extremely happy. I was like, I wanted my drama thunder and I got drama thunder. But that Zeus's law is then said to be violated by what he does in his house. No, it's not. Now they generally keep it a secret for like a night because they're like, we're still, it's still just basically me against an army. But no, he didn't violate Xenia. I have to wonder, one, is this a conscious choice he made where he goes, okay, I understand what Xenia is. I'm gonna, maybe Wilson calls it Zeus's law and he's gonna call it Zeus's law. And I'm gonna make a conscious choice and change so that it fits my narrative. That's one thing. And I could understand that choice, whether or not I agree with it. I don't totally love it. It's not my favorite thing, but that's because I want the even more satisfying ending of him, killing everybody and just being like, damn right, eat shit. Like, there's no consequences for this. I mean, there almost are, but there's not ultimately. Whatever. Or is this a case of whatever the fuck Emily Wilson said in her translation, which I've never finished because I just had to stop reading it. made him think that that's what this was? That's like, these are questions I would love to have answered because I'm curious. It's not a violation of Xenia. And so he and Penelope are never at risk of exile. Neither is neither is Telemachus. If it's clear that he's operating under the orders of his father, like were he to do it himself, he might end up in trouble. Again, you have to declare Odysseus dead before you do anything because you need to establish that now Telemachus rules the roost. Like he's the head of the house. But once it's clear that like he knows this is Odysseus is back, Odysseus is the one making these decisions, there's no issue. This is Odysseus' house, you violated Xenia, he can do whatever the fuck he wants, to the ancient Greeks. Does that suit Nolan's narrative? No, not when we've taken Odysseus on this journey of having to accept that this idea that when you go past a certain point, there's no going back from it, and civilization is ultimately going to collapse because of it. Again, I appreciate the more modern psychological look at the effect of something like Troy and what that has on the world. And of course, he tries to make it an even grander concept and tie it into the falling of the Bronze Age and all this stuff, which feels very mythic, feels very, the microcosm affecting the macrocosm and all of that. Oh, I get it. And it totally makes sense in his film. Somebody who knows Xenia and is like, wait, no, but part of the joy is that he didn't break Xenia, they did, so all bets are off. Like, the vicious part of me wants a little more of the Homer in that. And then, so this all then ties into who is Athena. Is that even Athena? And I think that's a valid question to ask. Again, Nolan leaves it really ambiguous. Is that even Athena? Or is that kind of his own guilt manifesting? And rather like, for the men, anytime the sea turned against them, they assume they're like, Poseidon is angry at us. Anytime we hear a thunderclap, we think that's Zeus. Is it, this is Athena? Or is it not? Are these gods real? Are they not? And I think back to the film's opening with in a time of apparent magic, which leaves a lot of ambiguity to any of the more mystical elements. There's a lot of it that's then left kind of, shit, did that actually happen? Is that real? Because one of the big things about Odysseus is he's often kind of seen as like a trickster character, which makes sense. You doubt how much of his story actually happened, as so many of that is coming from the horse's mouth. Now, I would also make the argument that because the poet, the omniscient poet, will say Homer, never denies anything that Odysseus says, I think you can make an argument that if he's embellishing, it's not that much, and he's not outright, or at least he's not outright lying in any of his story. So, Nolan leaves that ambiguity. Are some people gonna like it? Like me, I like the ambiguity because I like sitting there going, now, is she real or is she not? There is a kind of, I'm not entirely certain at times. I personally like that. Other people want it to be more concrete. And for the Greeks, it was way more concrete in their minds. Like, nope, that's a god. It was way more concrete to the Greeks. So I can appreciate, for some people, they want it to be more concrete. And I think
the other thing about the ending and the loss of the moment with the olive tree bed is really the other thing about the ending with the loss of the olive tree bed and that specific reunion between Odysseus and Penelope, as well as then, again, the changes to the idea of Xenia to become Zeus's law in the film, and the way the film has Odysseus and Penelope just sort of sailing off into the sunset in exile. This is a moment where, again, in the context of the film itself, in the script, there's nothing objectively wrong with it on the page. But it's an adaptive choice where, admittedly, I feel like you lose something that even Homer understood and recognized and made clear in his work, which is that, yes, even though the poem ends with Odysseus slaying all the suitors, taking his house back, Athena rolling in a deus ex machina to say, okay, everybody, enough, and making sure that the Nostos wraps up with a nice bow, we understand that Odysseus' journey overall is not over. Yes, his Nostos is complete. His return home is complete. He's completed what he needed to do. But Tiresias gave him a prophecy that said, you have deeply angered Poseidon, FYI. You've done quite a bit. You will have to journey even more so. You need to find a land where people have never even experienced the sea, where they've never used salt to season their food. And there you must essentially build a temple to Poseidon. You need to give great offerings and you do need to do stuff like this. So
Odysseus has this beautiful reunion with Penelope in a set that Athena like stretches, basically has a little chat with Eos, and Helios goes, hey, can you wait a bit? Can we extend a night? And gives him this long, beautiful reunion so Odysseus can tell her his story and she can tell him what's gone on. But at the same time with the understanding that he's gonna have to leave again. And if you know the mythic tradition of Odysseus, you have to acknowledge the telegony, which we all hate talking about, because you acknowledge that he and Circe had a kid, and that kid's gonna come to Ithaca, and without realizing it, because he doesn't realize who he's attacking, he's gonna kill Odysseus, which kind of makes no sense with Tiresias' prophecy, but whatever. If you take out the telegony, even then, the ending of Nolan's film just sort of loses. It has a bittersweetness of its own, but it's the wrong kind of bittersweet. In that it's like, oh, it's sad they have to leave home, but at least they're together. Whereas the bittersweetness of the Odyssey, as Homer brought it, was like, his war still isn't done. Like, he's still not done. He has to leave again. And that's something that you lose in Nolan's film. I'm going to quote here something that my grandfather wrote because I think it's important. Where he's talking about the bed trick. He goes, he's passed her test, the spell of estrangement is broken, they melt into one another's arms. But the story does not end there, where romantics would have it end with the lovers united. There's more, and it is harsh. The long-awaited husband must leave again on a mission whose length and outcome are uncertain. In his travels, he has offended the sea god Poseidon. In expiation, he must journey inland until he finds a people who have no knowledge of the sea or ships or salted food, and who mistake the oar he must carry on his shoulder for a winnowing fan. Only then, after sacrifices to the offended god, can he return home again. How that journey ends, we never find out. That is how Homer's poem ends, without an ending, leaving us hanging between the consoling hopefulness of a folktale and the unwelcome truth of tragedy. And as he then notes with Nolan's film, he goes, instead, in Nolan's film, we see Odysseus and Penelope sailing off into the setting sun as if in a Hollywood Western. That is an essential difference from Homer. Nolan's film fails many times in fidelity to Homer's original, but to so alter a narrative's conclusion is to compromise its essence, what it means to call it by its name. Nolan's Odyssey's impressive filmmaking, no question about it, but Homer, it ain't. There are many ways in which I do and don't disagree. Yeah, no, I don't think this film is Homer. I don't think this film could ever be Homer. That's for me, the big thing in looking at adaptation and understanding he's never going to truly encapsulate the original source material because it's a completely different medium. It has things that film can't do. But I do agree that I think the changing of the ending, with the fact of understanding that Odysseus' journey is not yet done. His Nostos is done. The story of his Odyssey, that Nostos, is done. But his journey is not done. His overall ending is not yet complete. We are only getting a small snapshot. In the same way with the Iliad, we only get a small snapshot. We are given a brief window into year 9 of the war. We understand a whole lot of shit has happened before. We also understand that a whole lot of shit is going to come after. And the Iliad as a poem is hyper obsessed with constantly foretelling or reminding you this is leading to the death of, Achilles, who's our primary hero in the story, who we really follow in the plot. This is going to lead to the end of Troy. Like, it's constantly foreshadowing. In the same way, the Odyssey is constantly reminding you, by the way, he pissed off Poseidon. They are a sea people. He's an island people, and he pissed off the god of the sea. He's got fucking work he still needs to do. And while part of me can maybe understand this idea that, but you want to have a satisfactory conclusion to this kind of story, I'm sort of surprised that Nolan didn't go for the ambiguous ending. We've seen him do it before in films like Inception. The constant argument. Was Leo DiCaprio's character awake or in a dream at that point? Is never successfully answered because of the ending shot with the spinning top, and people have theorized left and right. The thing with the Odyssey is you absolutely could have done it that way. You could have ended it and it is bittersweet. Like, that is a very bittersweet ending. You get this beautiful moment, but no, in the back of your head, it's not gonna last. And in the same way that he's sort of, that Nolan is sort of trying to make this, as you would say, like this film about the sunset of a civilization, the ending of a civilization, where we're seeing the looming end of the Bronze Age. I'm like, you didn't need to have them sail off into the sunset to have that still happen. So this is one of those things where I'd be like, okay, Nolan, why did we go for this ending? What does it bring exactly. I don't really think it brings anything specifically to the table. I don't even think it fully brings the conclusion of all of the thematic storyline in a way that the original didn't. And that I actually think the original ending that lets us know, okay, this bit's done, there's still more work to do, I actually think might have benefited the film more. It's one of the few major changes or, adaptive changes that's made in the film that I truly think doesn't help the film as so much as actually kind of hinder it in terms of an adaptation and actually in terms of what the film is trying to do. I think hewing actually closer to the original ending would have not only been more satisfying, it actually would have served the theme and you still could have the bittersweet ending. And it was the one bit where I really sat for a very long time trying to wrestle with how I felt about it. Because again, on an objective level, I can't argue with it in terms of writing. Like, there's nothing technically wrong with it, right? Like, I can't sit there and go, well, that doesn't make sense. I'm like, no, he set up all the tentpoles and it makes sense in terms of filmic storytelling and all this stuff. It's just one of those things where I go, as that one bit of adaptation, I think you did actually really lose something there. And that's even with such a highly narrowly focused film. The original ending was perfectly fine and actually really would have served it, I think. Because if you're even talking about going through stages of grief and trauma, you can come to the acceptance that you did something that has fundamentally shifted the course of everything. But it almost seems like he and Penelope are sort of running away from the problem at the end. And I'm like, wait a minute. No, the whole point is, yes, he will have to leave again, but that's because his work is not done. If you want to talk about a story of trauma, you don't just suddenly wake up and you're fine. You still have to work. Trauma is not a linear process. Grief is not a linear process. And you will continue to live with it and work with it. So I don't know. Again, it's very hard for me oftentimes when I make these kinds of criticisms where it's not really clear, like, it's not one of those things where it's an obvious objective construction problem with, like, the script or something, or the actual storytelling happening in the film. But on an adaptation level, I do agree with my grandfather that I think something is lost there. If the ending were changed, I think, honestly, again, even with all the other stuff that's not in the film, that ending is one that I do think is... The changing of the ending is one that definitely left me feeling, I'll say, unsettled and kind of disappointed. And I was like, oh, such a direct contradiction. And it's one that I don't think is better. I don't even think it's equal. I do think it actually kind of hurts the film a little bit. So that was the one major adaptive change. I walked away just going, ooh, no. I've kind of breezed through a lot of this ending because, again, I've had to film this in parts. So my thoughts are kind of all over the place. At the end of the day, let's do this as, like, too long, didn't want to watch all of this. Did I enjoy the movie as a film in its own right? Absolutely. It's a stunning piece of filmmaking. There's no denying that. Like, you can't say it's not a monumental work of filmmaking. It is. Everything about it is beautiful. I mean, some of the designs I didn't love, and that could be personal taste, but I would also still be curious to hear, like, again, I want, like, a 3+ hour documentary on, like, just the making of the film and the thought that went into, like, why did we design it this way? Why did we choose this route? I want to know all of the choices behind that because I'm curious, and it helps me understand the film more, and really get into the head of the creators. So sure, there were some costumes I didn't love. Yeah, the broom helmets are silly, let's be real. Would have loved some boar tusks. I wish that the armor on a lot of these people, especially Odysseys men, didn't seem quite so uniform. I think they tried to give them moments of individuality, but it shouldn't be uniform. Because this was BYOB. Bring your own bronze. Nobody had the same kit and caboodle. It's why they were all trying to loot bodies. I don't love the design of Circe's kind of weird little medieval witch hut. I was sort of confused by it. Some of the look of the Trojan armor is a little... I kind of blink at it and want to know why. A lot of it is I want to know why. Explain to me why, and I'm willing to hear you out. I can then say, okay, I understand. I still don't love it, but I understand. There were some, like, sets I was kind of like, I have questions. I don't really know. I mean, again, the Scylla monster, I'm kind of like, I don't love it. But I wasn't really thinking about it that hard. So sure, that's... And a lot of that, I think, for me, comes down to kind of personal taste, where I go, he made a choice, I don't have to love it, it's whatever. I mean, in some choices, I thought I wasn't gonna like, I ended up loving, like the black Darth Vader armor for Agamemnon, I thought actually in context of the film worked brilliantly. And I was totally ready to go, I don't know what I feel about it. I mean, it's whatever, but I was like, damn, this actually, like, thematically and with the character kind of slaps. So that's one thing. As an adaptation, rather like most adaptations I have found of Homer, where it's very much, this is Odysseus on his adventure. So I'm not thinking of things like Ulysses by James Joyce, or O Brother, Where Art Thou? Or things that are inspired by the Odyssey in that way, but are clearly not like the Odyssey. We're not following Odysseus or anything like that. So when I think of all the films that are adapting the Odyssey, or even musicals, we'll say, I think that it had more glimpses for me of feeling like I'm witnessing Homer, and especially in a very thoughtful way, than the others. But is it Homer? No, it's not. And this comes down, and I say maybe this comes down to the fact that I studied adaptation. I studied it under a working screenwriter, and a lot of people who study adaptation, we often are more interested in looking at what's different than what's the same. Because here's the thing, like reading your favorite book, seeing it on screen, you'll love it, but you'll go, well, it's not totally the book. Of course it's not. You can never fully recreate your experience of encountering a story in its, we'll say, original form. For most of us, it would be reading the Odyssey. I can never have that recreated for me in another medium, because it's a different medium. There are certain things with the Odyssey, which is this massive story, this massive plot with a ton of micro narratives in it that detours all over the place, that's tackling 6 billion themes. Only the epic poem can do that. It's got 24 books and 12,000 plus lines in ancient Greek, or however many you get in English, which usually it's a lot more. You cannot capture that in a film, even when you push your runtime to 3 hours, without it feeling really shallow, a little probably disorganized and scatterbrained, and also feeling almost like weirdly episodic. The fact that Nolan went in and said, I need a connective theme. Here's what I'm taking. He goes, I find it interesting. These are all war vets. Everybody seems like they need therapy. What if we, and I'm going to take the more modern understanding of what an attritional war does, what we understand in the modern day psychologically of what war does to people. And maybe how would a person feel when they've created this new way or used this new thought process to create a more insane and brutal way of then killing other people, and in this case en masse, and you then are witnessing the most devastating siege of a city that's in literature, that sets the precedent for what the Greeks thought the fall of a city would be. I'm sure later when the Persians sacked Athens, the Athenians who were hiding out on the nearby island who escaped are probably having echoes of Troy in their mind, right? It was so terrifying and devastating to them. What Nolan does that's different is all done in the service of that theme and the film's story and its arc that it's on. So I can't say that's bad adaptation. But there are parts of it where I go, I don't know how much I love that. And it's gonna come down to how do you feel about the changes, which is what most adaptation is. It's not about what they keep the same, it's about what they do different. How do you feel about that? There are some of them I don't totally love. The changing of Xenia to Zeus's law and how Zeus's law functions, I don't totally love how it comes at the end. I can reasonably deal with it throughout most of the film. At the end, I was like, I'm left a little unsure. Like, I get it. Don't know if I love it. The changing of Helen and Menelaus. Yeah, I don't love it, but I also have to sit there and go, nobody's been agreed on their relationship or how they feel about each other or like what the dynamic is for millennia. So pick your poison. You know, I can say that's not how I would like to see them portrayed, but there are plenty of scholars who would say, yeah, that's totally fine. There were enough moments where I went, I feel the Homeric like sense, which I think the fall of Troy, maybe with the exception of that bit with Cassandra, like the two editions, the stuff with Sinon and the stuff with the priestess of Athena, who I'm just gonna call in my head Cassandra, those are a little more Virgilian, but the rest of it I go, yeah. The feeling of Agamemnon and his presence, yeah. The underworld, yeah. Chunks of the Polyphemus cave, yeah. The sirens, yes. I was so surprised that it ended up being one of the, like, for me, the most affecting and, like, brilliant moments. I was like, this feels so Homer. Like, moments of the slaughter, yes. Like, there were so many moments where I went, yeah, I feel the Homeric sense. Am I missing a lot of the themes that are there in Homer? Yes. Do I genuinely miss them? Of course. I love exploring the ethos of the Greek hero and how fucked up these guys all are. Like, I love the stuff you really can look at and the way it digs into identity, and especially with that relation to the Greek hero and everything else. But on the same side, I have to appreciate and understand that when you're doing a, 3-hour movie, you have to pick. You have to make a choice. He made a choice and he stuck with it. And I'm like, I can't say you were ever unfocused. This is a very focused adaptation. It's pretty narrowly focused, but it is focused. It is dialed. That script is tight as hell. And again, maybe it's because I do have part of the thing of loving Homer, but also having studied adaptation, having a pretty good understanding of how much stuff really does kind of have to change when you're changing mediums, and looking at something like the Odyssey and being like, I don't know how you put that in a film, even when you clock 3 hours. I knew I was never getting Homer. What I wanted to see was what was he going to latch onto within the Odyssey, and what journey he would take me on. I do also think there's an element of this film that is going to be, if you like Christopher Nolan movies, you'll be pleased with it as a film. If you don't like Christopher Nolan movies, I don't think this movie will change your mind. It's pretty much all the stuff Chris Nolan has always done in terms of storytelling, like perfectly encapsulated in a film. Like, obviously, yes, I'm not getting the same super rich, colorful, nuanced characters that are in the poem, because it's a level that really, I think, only can come from that poem. And when you're also taking a very narrow focus and you're being constantly aware of the IMAX camera and everything else, like, I'm never going to be one to completely discard the fact that they were working around some technical interestings, if you will. We heard all the story of what it was like to shoot with that IMAX camera, which had to be put in its own little blimp, the mirror system, the film could only run for 3 minutes before you had to change the mag. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on. You could wonder how much of that might impact performance, the ability to shoot things. When we come down to the script, it is very tight. Nolan has always been a very thematic writer more than anything else. He likes to take a theme and rotate on it, and, explore it and rotate on it. The Odyssey, he's doing that. It is very much a kind of thematic sibling of Oppenheimer. This idea that somebody in a time of war pushes the ability to wage war and to kill people to a whole, you move the finish line, basically. You raise the bar, you shift the paradigm. And you wonder, does somebody regret that? Now, Homer never explores the idea of if Odysseus regrets that. Granted, Homer is not really exploring psychology or the psyche at all. Now, granted, psyche, that word for them meant the soul. It was the thing that left your body and went to the underworld. That's really all it's mentioned as, especially in the Iliad. We've obviously gone through a lot of exploration of psychology, and even the exploration of psychology of veterans, tying it to the Homeric heroes. There are 2 books. One is called Achilles in Vietnam, and the other, I believe, is called Odysseus in America, which is using these Homeric heroes to tie to the psychology of war veterans after they receive what we would call a moral wound, where they're not physically injured, but something about what they've just done doesn't kind of sit right with them, and they feel injured in a more kind of spiritual, moral, psychological, ethical sense. And I think Nolan was kind of took that angle with Odysseus. Again, it's a valid angle of exploration. It's really narrow, and because you're doing film, you have to be so narrowly focused. So you do lose a lot. And this is my way of saying, if you go in wanting Homer, just Homer, you're not going to get it. I went in with neutral expectations. I was cautiously optimistic that I'd enjoy it, which I did. But I didn't go in expecting to get the full color, bombastic, insane, epic poem in front of me. And so therefore, because I went in, I think, with reasonable expectations, I got a lot out of it. There were a lot of things I could be super nerdy about. There were certain things I could go, how the fuck do you mistake Helios for Apollo? And there are, again, certain things where I go, that's a choice. I don't know how I feel about it. And also, the reason why this video is so late is I took almost a week to try and sift through my feelings and my thoughts and figure out how much of this is I'm not sure how I feel or how I like it on a subjective level. How much of this is there a problem with the script or something like that. And it took me a long time to sift through that and also to get all my nerdy shit out. So there's that. And it's also why I filmed this in parts and why this is going to be extremely long. So at the end of the day, I enjoyed it. I still do agree that I think it's one of the best adaptations of Greek mythology that's, you know, trying to really be that adaptation on screen. I do think it's one of the best, if not the best. And anybody who comes at me and says Troy is the best, I'm going to slap you upside the head and go, no, it fucking ain't. That movie also has moments that I really like, but its script is a fucking mess and I hate it. I'm angry at that movie. Don't even talk to me about that movie. And it's been very weird to see it touted around like it's the greatest adaptation of Greek mythology, mostly by certain people of a certain type. So that's been a wild time. But yeah, no, look, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. As an adaptation, I found it fascinating. I was like, wow, okay. Is there stuff that's missing that I would love to have? Of course. Is there a lot of stuff that was changed that I actually found interesting? But I still really enjoyed it. I also had a really good theater experience, which is awesome. And I thought it was still a very thoughtful film. It certainly has some issues as an adaptation. You could say the characters are not as well developed or colorful or whatever have you. I think that's been a reasonably consistent critique of Nolan's films from the beginning. I also think it's because he's more interested in theme and narrative than he is necessarily in making these super colorful characters. And I think that's one of those things where if you don't like that about Nolan, I don't know if it's ever going to change for you. If you do like it if you're fine with that, then it won't bother you. Is it perfect? No. Anybody who says it's a perfect adaptation, they're lying to you. It's not. You're never going to get one. I think that's what's most important, is you're never going to get one. You can't. Because you can never recreate that feeling that the original story in its like OG medium. And in this case, yeah, none of us are getting a bard telling it to us. So for us, we will say in a book format. You're never going to perfectly capture that in a movie. That's the thing with adaptation. You have to know and accept that. And so then it comes down to, how is that executed? And there will be things you like and things you don't. Things you personally miss. And again, like I've had talks with my grandfather where even he says, like, I told him, here are kind of my thoughts of how Nolan seems to have approached the film. And as I was told, your analysis is very thorough and very thoughtful. He goes, as somebody, and from his perspective, as somebody who has studied Homer for so many decades. My grandfather's in his 90s. This is like his life. Who wrote his book, Man in the Middle Voice, who's so deeply invested. For him, it was a disappointment. And I'm not going to say that's wrong. I will never say that's wrong. And I'm like, look, I can't disagree. You're going to get different stuff out of it. And you may walk out happy. You may walk out disappointed. It's very hard for me to say, like, so many things ride on this film with how you feel about Christopher Nolan and how he makes movies. What matters to you in adaptation, like what matters to you, is going to define how you feel about this film. And for me, I often will watch films like these and they're almost like a kind of, we'll say, analytical, academic, intellectual exercise. Like I enjoy picking it apart and guessing at influences and seeing stuff. And again, stuff I like, stuff I don't. I don't know if I can then quantify like a rating of it as an adaptation, but it is certainly one of the best and one of the better ones because of how it executed its adaptation, even when there's stuff that I don't agree with and don't like. I don't know, that's kind of a lame ending. That's all I got.